Chapter 263. Raphael, you didn't kill another dragon, did you? Gibran's voice was so excited that it was out of tune. This dragon crystal's energy waves are very pure. Heavens, it must be a dragon that's about to evolve. Julia also cried out. Jeds looked at Hanjin with a face full of shock. He had to admit that he had underestimated his opponent's strength. A few days ago, before Hanjin left, Jeds had repeatedly warned him not to get into a conflict with the Dragon Knight, Grand Magus, and other super powerhouses under Nicola. Of course, Jeds had good intentions, but now it seemed that his good intentions were a bit laughable. If a person really had reached the peak of strength, they would have already formed their own style and judgment in battle. There was no need for Jeds to tell them whether or not to fight, or how to fight. Sunir, Morrison's, and the others were also stunned. Although Hanjin had the title of Dragon Slayer, they knew in their hearts how the title came about. They believed in Hanjin's strength. The mysterious and huge magic circle and the earth-shattering magic were the best proof. However, they were still a little unsure in their hearts, because Hanjin had never killed a dragon with his own hands. Now, looking at the shining dragon crystal in front of them, all their doubts disappeared. In the past, when they heard others say that Hanjin was a dragon slayer, they would always smile knowingly, but from now on, they would never smile like that again. Dwight Steele's cheeks twitched. As a Wyvern Knight, he had always dreamed of conquering a dragon and becoming a real Dragon Knight. However, he knew that his strength was not enough to compete with a dragon. After all, dreams were just dreams. He had never thought of putting them into action, and that dragon crystal had the greatest impact on him. Hanjin shrugged. It would be too troublesome to explain, and he didn't want to tell anyone about Murphy's matter. In his mind, dragons were a different kind of demon. If he was faced with a fox demon that could speak human language, no matter how beautiful the fox demon was, he would mercilessly attack. Those who were not of the same race were bound to have different intentions. There is never any trust between cultivators and demons. On the other hand, if the fox demon had the upper hand, she would also attack. To demons, a cultivator's primordial essence, primordial spirit, and even flesh were great supplements. In a modern society where spiritual energy was declining day by day, the conflict between the mysterious sect and the demons for survival and development had become extremely cruel. There was no difference between dragons and demons, or at least that was what Hanjin thought. Of course, there were also the entanglements, friendships, and even love between humans and demons, but those were all extreme examples. Hanjin said that he was lucky to have another life, which meant that Hanjin had already been killed at that time. Sunir couldn't help but grit her teeth and say, "What a vicious child." And then, I wanted to kill him, but he released the absolute barrier and said that it was made by Sir Jeds himself. Hanjin's gaze fell on Jeds. Then he escaped. You were right not to kill him. Jeds smiled bitterly. Otherwise, you would have suffered from Nicholas' crazy revenge. Oh, Hanjin was stunned. He is Nicholas' only son, called Tinos. Jeds hesitated. Sigh. Hanjin was dumbfounded. When he had jumped out of the ground and launched the attack, there had been a strong 10th grade knight on the opposite side, which had given him a headache. He had realized that the child's identity was somewhat special, but he had never thought that he was the only son of Nicholas. Recalling the previous scene, if he was given another chance, would he have made a prompt decision to kill him? Yes, he definitely would. If you want to destroy someone, you must first make them crazy. Nicholas, who had a strategic plan, fought steadily and knew when to advance and when to retreat, was the scary one. Unfortunately, the opportunity was fleeting. Who is Nicholas? Sunir asked in surprise. Gibran just remembered that he hadn't introduced Jeds yet. Sasu came over and talked about Lang Ning, then military supplies, then the dragon crystal, then the child, and finally Nicholas. Only then did they return to the main topic. Gibran smiled and said, "Come, let me introduce you. This is Sir Jeds from the Vatican, the Archbishop, and the Supreme Arbiter of the Inquisition." Only Morrisons didn't realize what an Archbishop represented. On the other side, Sunir, Dwight Steele, and the others all had dignified expressions. They all went up to greet Jeds, and Jeds responded with a smile. Sassoon liked to tell stories, but he didn't know what had happened, so he could only let Leger play the role of a bard for once. From the rescue of Winston and the others, to the encirclement of the Thunderbirds, to feeling the outbreak of the forbidden spell, to Han Jin going to the Kingdom of Light, and then coming back. Leger's memory was very good, and his story didn't deviate too much from the truth. He even described some details clearly. Sunir and the others didn't expect so many things to happen, and they were all fascinated by the story. It wasn't until dusk that Leger talked about the dragon crystal. They were also here just now, but Han Jin still didn't reveal how he killed the dragon. They subconsciously thought that Han Jin wanted to hide the secret of his magic, so they all tacitly avoided the topic. She hid far away. She had already removed all the seals on the several space rings that Han Jin had given her. There were all kinds of things piled up in front of her. There were magic crystals, weapons, armor, and so on. There were also clothes, handkerchiefs, and other daily necessities. However, the space ring worn by Nicola's son, Tinos, stumped Yelena. She closed her eyes slightly and used her mind power to sense the sealing magic array inside. It was a very strange and complicated sealing technique that she had never seen before. Jeds had left the crowd at some point and walked to Yelena's side. He quietly looked at Yelena until she opened her eyes with a depressed expression. Then he whispered, "Do you think the sealing magic array is strange? Haha, this is the masterpiece of Grand Magus Xi-Linki." Grand Magus? Yelena frowned. By the way, just now, Jeds slowly changed the topic. The Magus said that the army is preparing to attack the Bite Man. Raphael has his own army? Aren't you mercenaries? Raphael is the lord of Black Raven City. How could he not have his own army? Yelena's mouth curved into a sly smile. Are you interested in his army? Well, yes. Jeds nodded. Haha, you really are an honest person. Yelena was amused. On the other side, Han Jin suddenly said, "Why are you all here? Hogan and Alexander have always been at odds. If no one keeps them in check, they might cause a lot of trouble. I sent Alexander to attack the Bite Man." Sunir smiled. Why? Lang Ning said in his letter that although he wiped out the Bite Man army and Woodrow's army, Riptide also suffered some casualties. Coincidentally, Hogan had already released the ring of restraint on a few hundred slaves. According to Alexander, they were originally outstanding warriors, so I sent Alexander to help Lang Ning. Sunir observed Han Jin's expression as she spoke. Lang Ning has too few people. It's always good if they can help. Oh. Han Jin nodded. He wanted power, but his main goal was to train. In fact, he didn't have much desire for power, so he naturally approved of Sunir's decision. Don't worry, Raphael. We brought a lot of return scrolls. We can go back whenever we want. It's just that it's hard to say when we'll come. Morrison said, "We arrived 2 days after you left. Who knew that you would teleport us to the west? It took us a lot of effort to get here. If it weren't for Dwight Steele, we would have definitely gotten lost." Chapter 264. In the distance, the silhouette of a castle could be vaguely seen. Tim heaved a sigh of relief. He was finally back. He had lost count of how many battles he had gone through along the way. In that great war, not only were the races on the surface in a mess, but the system of the races in the abyss was also completely torn apart. Not all the underground races were willing to give face to the vampires, especially a lone vampire like him, who could easily become the prey of others. Although vampires had outstanding recovery abilities, Tim was now covered in wounds. His clothes were tattered, and he looked very miserable. However, upon seeing the castle in the distance, Tim's body seemed to have been injected with new energy, and he sped up. He didn't have a choice. He didn't dare to turn into a bat and fly in the sky in the abyss world. If he did that, his defense would be too weak, and it was very likely that he would be killed by the enemies lurking in the dark before he could turn into a human. At this time, a group of black dots flew over from the direction of the castle. They were moving very fast, and gradually Tim could see that it was a group of bats. He couldn't help but feel happy. The bats that appeared here should be his own race. Sure enough, the group of bats flew near Tim and turned into human forms, surrounding Tim in the middle. "Yo, isn't this our young master?" A young man in black clothes came up with a sloppy expression. He walked around Tim a few times and clicked his tongue. "What's wrong with you? Don't tell me you met a group of abyssal banshees?" Tim frowned. He didn't expect it to be this guy. This guy was famous for his sharp tongue among the younger generation of the race. Whether it was good or bad, there was only one thing for sure after meeting this guy, and that was that you must be in a bad mood. If it was any other time, Tim could still argue a little. However, he was really exhausted from the journey, and his mood was heavy. He didn't have time to care about the ridicule in the other party's words. He said in a deep voice, "I want to see the ancestor." Cayman's expression changed. "What happened?" Tim bit his lips and said word by word, "My mother and Caroline are dead." The surrounding vampires were all stunned. The atmosphere was particularly tense. After a long while, Cayman asked who did it. Tim shook his head. "Don't ask. I want to see the ancestor. I can take you there." At this point, Cayman hesitated. If it was any other time, he definitely wouldn't let go of this opportunity to attack Tim. But the problem was too serious. He didn't have the mood to bicker. "But," Trent gritted his teeth, "I know. I'll do it myself." "Yourself?" Carmen's jaw dropped. "Do you want to die?" "Ancestor, if you don't make a move, who will avenge my mother? What's the point of me living?" Tim roared with bloodshot eyes. "What does Zagun mean?" Tim snorted. Cayman sighed. "All right, I'll take you there." With that, he turned around and walked away, muttering, "I knew humans were King unreliable. Did you see that? Your cheap father is a lord." "How?" Tim followed behind with a face full of hatred. His mother was killed, but as his father, Zagun didn't do anything. Instead, he hooked up with that slut. Of course, no matter how much he disliked it, he wouldn't dare to express his dissatisfaction in front of Zagun. However, Tim had already made up his mind. When he saw the ancestor, he would definitely explain everything clearly. With the ancestor's temper, he would definitely be furious and teach his heartless father a lesson. Some vampires had already returned to inform their clansmen in the castle. When Tim reached the bottom of the castle gate was already wide open. Although Tim was just an insignificant person in the vampire community, his mother, Betty, was quite famous. Not every vampire could evolve their racial talents, and different talents determined their future status in the community. Betty's talent could definitely be considered as the best among her generation. Her death was a great loss to the vampire community. More importantly, Betty's child was coming back to awaken the ancestor. This was a major event that hadn't happened in hundreds of years. The ancestor wasn't a single person, but a group of old vampires that had lived for thousands of years. Any one of them had enough power to set off a bloody storm in the abyss. Most importantly, no matter who wanted to awaken them, they would have to pay the price, and that was blood. Vampires were bloodthirsty, but this didn't mean that they had an endless supply of blood. Awakening the slumbering ancestor was something that had happened before, but it was done by gathering the strength of everyone. If Betty didn't die and wanted to awaken the ancestor, she could have brought all the vampires under her. Each of them only needed to give a portion of their blood. Although their strength would be weakened, it was completely negligible. However, it was different this time. Tim was alone. When his mother, Betty, followed Zagun to the surface, she had already taken away all the vampires loyal to her. In other words, in the abyss, the nest of vampires, no one would sacrifice their blood for Tim. After all, the power of a vampire came from their blood. Could a person's blood awaken the ancestor? This was a question that many vampires in the castle were interested in. The only thing that was certain was that no one would help. Everyone was watching Tim walk into the castle with an attitude of watching a show, as if he was already a dead man. If it was someone who had never been to a vampire's nest, they would have been shocked by the scene in front of them. This was because there was nothing in the castle except for a huge hole that was emitting cold air. Standing at the edge of the hole, one could see that the depths of the hole were brightly lit. It turned out that the real buildings of the vampire's nest were all underground. This was also something that the other abyssal races had always been puzzled about. Why did the vampires, with their strength, only occupy such a small area? In fact, if the entire vampire's nest was dug out, it would be discovered that it was a huge pyramid-shaped building. As for the castle on the surface, it was just the tip of the tower. Tim cast a spell, turned into a bat, and flew into the hole. Cayman also followed him. As for Cayman's subordinates, they could only return to the surface to patrol because it was their turn to be on duty today. As Tim flew down, vampires turned into bats and followed him from time to time. Awakening the ancestor was a once-in-a-century event. Everyone wanted to take a look. Even those who had a grudge with Betty followed. There was no other reason other than to see how Betty's child died. The hole was very deep, extending down for tens of thousands of meters. There were no traces of man-made excavation in the depths. The walls of the hole were rocks that shone in the darkness. After a while, Tim finally flew to the bottom of the hole. On the surface of the ground, there was an incomparably huge magic formation. The lines that formed the magic formation were all deep grooves. There were still some dried black blood stains left in them, and a strong smell of blood assaulted his senses. Tim's expression changed. Although he had already decided to awaken the ancestor at any cost, looking at the crisscrossing grooves on the ground, Tim's heart sank. Even if he drained all his blood, he would only be able to fill a small part of it. The flapping of wings didn't stop. Vampires continuously flew down and hung on the walls of the hole. Tim looked up and saw at least several thousand bats hanging there. He couldn't help but bitterly smile. In front of so many clansmen, even if he died, he could only brace himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to raise his head for the rest of his life. No matter what, he couldn't let his mother's blood flow in vain. Taking a deep breath, Tim slowly knelt on the ground. He stretched out his sharp nails and cut the blood vessels on his wrist. Suddenly, bright red blood spurted out. Tim didn't dare waste the slightest bit of blood. He quickly aimed the wound at the grooves on the ground. As the blood spurted out, more and more blood fell into the grooves. Gradually, it converged into a stream of blood and slowly flowed in the grooves. A few light sighs came from above. Tim knew that as long as one had eyes, they would be able to see that his blood was insignificant for such a huge magic formation. But compared to his mother's grace of raising him, what was a mere life? Tim thought in his heart. As the blood in his body flowed out, his vitality was also fading little by little. Even his mind was starting to become unclear. In a dark cave, 6 huge coffins were placed around a hexagonal magic formation. If Tim was here, he would find that this magic formation was exactly the same as the one he was injecting his blood into. It was just slightly smaller. In the magic formation, a small stream of blood was slowly flowing. Every time it flowed past a rune, the rune would light up with a blood-red light. However, the speed of the blood flow was very slow. Only a small portion of the runes on the magic formation lit up. On the ground, Tim was still injecting his blood into the magic formation. Although his mind was a bit blurry, he still persisted in using his nails to cut open the wounds from time to time. The recovery ability of vampires was simply a big problem for Tim at this time. When the blood flowed past a coffin in the cave, the coffin suddenly trembled. An old and angry voice came from inside. "Damn it! What is this smell? Alquite, get out here! Look at what you've done!" A moment later, a mocking voice came from another coffin. "Victor, before you shout, you better think about your age. You're no longer a young boy." The old voice suddenly raised a few octaves. "Alquite, if I were you, I would immediately go and crush that damn bastard to death instead of staying here and smelling this disgusting stench." Alquite's voice was very surprised. "Why me? Shouldn't you be the one to be awakened this time? Because that bastard is your descendant." "Alquite, I didn't think that you would allow your descendant to do such a despicable thing. You've completely disgraced us vampires." Alquite was silent for a while before saying, "So he really is my descendant. Yes, this blood does have the smell of a human. All right, I admit it. It's my fault. Seeing that Alquid had admitted his mistake, Victor didn't say anything else. He just muttered, "Hurry up and get rid of that bastard. I hate this smell." The lid of the coffin that Alquid was in seemed to be lifted by a pair of invisible hands. Then, an old man with a pale face and neatly combed hair slowly sat up in the coffin. All right. I'll go, all right? Victor, stop complaining. He's just a small descendant. Why do you care so much about him?" Alquid said as he stepped out of the coffin. "This bastard has tainted our noble bloodline." Victor's voice sounded very angry. "Oh, come on. Don't be so old-fashioned." Alquid's expression was indifferent as he stood on top of the magic circle. However, in the next moment, his expression became somewhat sluggish. Damn it, this little amount of blood can't even activate the magic circle. Alquid was also a little angry. This is too normal. Can you expect anyone to sacrifice their own strength for a bastard? Forget it. Alquid sighed. I'll do it myself. It's just a little blood loss. It's not a big deal. You're right. It's not a big deal. Anyway, in the abyss, other than those black dragons and spirit dragons, no one dares to provoke you. It's not a big deal to have your strength reduced. Victor smiled maliciously. Alquid turned his head and looked at the coffin that Victor was in. Oh, dear Victor, aren't you going to help me? You see, you're sleeping here anyway. There's no danger at all. Why? Victor was angry. That's your descendant. Why do you have to drag me into this? Stop fooling around. Do you want me to be killed because of excessive blood loss? It's not good for anyone if I die. Alquid said with a smile. He didn't care about Victor's anger at all. Why don't you ask them for help? Victor still didn't want to lose his precious blood. Alquid shrugged. It's just a small matter. Do you want to wake everyone up? After hesitating for a while, Victor said angrily, It's my bad luck to have met you. Alquid immediately laughed happily. I knew it. Our Victor has the best heart. Shut up. What do you mean by our Victor? You're disgusting. After Victor finished speaking, he unwillingly chanted a spell. A drop of blood that emitted a faint golden light flew out of the coffin that he was in. Alquid extended his hand and caught the drop of blood. He chanted a spell, and a similar drop of blood flew out from between his eyebrows. When the two drops of blood landed on the magic circle, all the runes engraved on the magic circle lit up, and a dazzling white light filled the entire cave in an instant. At the same time, Tim, who was on the ground, finally couldn't hold on anymore and fainted. However, before he closed his eyes, he saw the huge magic circle in front of him suddenly light up. The white light dissipated, and Alquid appeared in the center of the magic circle. Happy New Year to everyone, and all the best. Chapter 265. Winston and Saxon wanted to go back. Most of them were single, but their thief Paul had a lover outside, and she was pregnant. Before they received the death mission, Paul had told them that he was going to take a break after a few months. In fact, both Winston and Saxon knew that Paul wanted to retire, but he didn't make it too clear because he didn't want to hurt his old friend's feelings. Now that Paul was dead, taking care of the woman had become everyone's responsibility. Being a mercenary was a profession full of sorrow and parting. If they didn't help their own people, then the life of a mercenary would be too boring and dark. Jedis also wanted to go to isolated Cliff City to take a look. After being attacked by Nicholas, he was indeed greatly hurt, both mentally and physically. However, he was still able to hold on because he still had hope. Hanjin had returned without success, and he was completely discouraged. Although no one could see anything unusual on the surface, only he knew how much he wanted to give up. He just wanted to live the rest of his life in a daze, and no longer cared about his dreams. However, Jedis never expected that Hanjin was actually a lord. Moreover, he was a lord who had already overcome the difficult period of starting a business, and his career was on the rise. Didn't he hear Sasu say that Hanjin's army had already launched a counterattack? Jedis' heart was alive again, and he was eager to learn more about the situation. It was useless to listen to others, and he had to see it for himself. It just so happened that Sasu and the others had brought a lot of town portal scrolls, which could be used to transport people and the little Thunderbirds back in batches. Spatial magic was like other magic. It was restricted by various laws. Things that were too large couldn't be transported away with spatial magic, unless it was a special magic scroll. It also couldn't be transported with too many life units. Although the little Thunderbirds were similar to chicks, they still took up one life unit. With Hanjin around, none of this was a problem. For the first time, he and Sunir took a dozen little Thunderbirds back, and when they arrived at the station, he handed them over to Sunir to take care of. Although the little Thunderbirds and Sunir hadn't known each other for a long time, they were very close to Sunir, far more than Yelena. This made Yelena extremely jealous, and she cursed them for being traitors countless times. Then, Hanjin returned to the forest. His talisman was still effective, and he could immediately capture Yelena's position. Riding on the sword was much faster than hurrying through the forest, and even if he was teleported to a corner, it wouldn't affect anything. It would take him at most 2 days to reach Thunder Valley. To Jedis, Hanjin was just Hanjin because he didn't know about Hanjin's past. However, to Sunir and the others, they could all feel the amazing changes in Hanjin. In the past, Hanjin was just a pool of clear water. From the surface, one could see the depth of the pool at a glance, and even the stones at the bottom of the pool. As for what was under the stones, that was Hanjin's own secret. They didn't know whether the pool was getting deeper or muddier, but in any case, they felt that Hanjin was becoming more and more unfathomable. During those years when they were wandering around, they enjoyed blessings and weathered hardships together. When they were free, they would talk nonsense and fight side by side when they encountered problems. Now, Hanjin said whatever he wanted to say and laughed whenever he wanted to, but there was a great change in him. He was less flamboyant and more serious than before. However, other than Sunir, who was trying her best to find out the reason, the others didn't pay much attention to Hanjin's changes. They were all busy with their own things. Jedis was busy dealing with the Chamber of Commerce and the Mercenary Association. As the Archbishop of the Holy See, he was qualified to talk to any lord as an equal. Hanjin's side wasn't lacking in manpower. There were warriors, magicians, knights, and even a general who was starting to show his talent. However, what they lacked was a talent in diplomacy. Hallister was handsome and eloquent, but his status and strength were too low. Jedis, on the other hand, was different. His calm temperament, style of conversation, and his sincere smile were always able to win the favor of others at first sight. Yelena was even busier. She and the space ring were at loggerheads, and they wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. In the past, when she was researching alchemy with Hogan, she knew to go back to the station to rest. Now, she stayed in the alchemy lab all day and night, never going out. Winston and Saxon were also busy. In addition to settling down Paul's widow, they also had to think about their own futures. They were the only 2 left in the Reaper mercenary team, and the Red Vanguards weren't much better off than the Reapers. Gibran and Winston discussed whether they could form a mercenary team. Of course, this included Hanjin and Yelena. As for who would take the top position, Winston and Gibran were very calm. It was very simple. Only the capable would take the top position. Hanjin was definitely the best choice. Coincidentally, just as Winston and Gibran were discussing, Dwight Steele of the Dragon Singer mercenary group suddenly came to their door. In fact, how far a person could go could be proven by various signs. The Dragon Singer mercenary group was created by Dwight Steele. When he was young, he met a few good friends and brothers who he could entrust his life to. They became the backbone of the Dragon Singer mercenary group in the future. If he hadn't met a few brothers, if they hadn't supported him, would the Dragon Singer mercenary group be as strong as it was today? Even the birth of the Dragon Singer mercenary group was still unknown. Not to mention Hanjin's strength. The young Magus Yelena had become Hanjin's partner. The Red Vanguards and the Reapers, 2 top mercenary teams, had met with misfortune one after the other. It was inevitable that they would be reorganized and find their own positions. If nothing unexpected happened, the survivors would become Hanjin's right-hand men. Moreover, Hanjin was a lord. The Chamber of Commerce Alliance and the Mercenary Association were all trying to build a good relationship with Hanjin. Now, Archbishop Jedis, who had a high position in the Vatican, had joined Han Jin's group. What did this mean? Every time Dwight Steele saw Han Jin, he would have the illusion that he was looking at his younger self. He was sure that Han Jin had flown higher and walked further than he had. Once, he accidentally heard Yelena and Jedis discussing the problem of stacking spells. After listening for a while, he realized that Jedis could release 2 forbidden spells at the same time. At that time, Dwight Steele was so shocked that he broke out in a cold sweat. In a battle between a mage and a warrior, a mage already had a certain advantage. If spells could be stacked together, it would be terrifying. If it was only Yelena, Dwight Steele would have respected Han Jin. However, the disbanding and reorganization of 2 top mercenary teams forced him to think carefully. Han Jin was also a lord, and there was also Jedis. All of these added together made Dwight Steele see his future clearly. Some things were better done earlier than later. Dwight Steele did not only represent his own opinion. Before he found Winston and Gibran, he had already contacted several mercenary groups and teams, as well as many freelance mercenaries. Dwight Steele's goal was to form an unprecedented super mercenary group. Winston and Gibran were both tempted by Dwight Steele's idea, and after a long discussion, they came to an agreement on the general direction. Dwight Steele had even thought of a name for the mercenary group, and he proposed to call it the Dragon-Slaying Mercenary Group. Who he really favored could be seen from the name alone. However, there was already a dragon-slaying mercenary group in isolated Cliff City. It was a third-rate mercenary group with only 12 members, and the leader was a high-level warrior. This was not a problem for Dwight Steele, and after notifying the Mercenary Association, he forcefully canceled the mercenary group. Winston and Gibran found Han Jin and discussed their ideas. Han Jin was very supportive of their idea, but he was firmly against the name. He had always remembered what Guevara had said. The name dragon slaying was very taboo. If they stayed in isolated Cliff City, it would be fine, but if they wanted to go out and explore the vast world, they would cause a lot of trouble sooner or later. What would the tyrannical existences in Dragon City and Dragon Field think? What would they do? Actually, it was easy to understand. For example, if a Japanese ID named Kill Chinese suddenly appeared in a Chinese forum in another world, what kind of treatment would they receive? Everyone would attack them. Winston and Gibran had no choice but to find Dwight Steele again, and after a long discussion, they finally decided on the name of the super mercenary group. The King Mercenary Group. The name was a bit tacky, but it had its own meaning. An unprecedented super mercenary group would of course be the king of the mercenary world. On the other hand, it also implied people's expectations. Would the leader of the mercenary group become a true king in the future? The people's stance was firm and unquestionable. Edwina, Hayden, and Charles had all died at the hands of vampires. Gibran knew that he and Julia couldn't avenge their friends and family on their own, so they could only work together with Han Jin. When Han Jin decided to wage war against Segund, it would be time for them to take revenge. Winston and Saxon were also very firm. If Han Jin hadn't brought people to save them, the entire Reaper mercenary team would have been wiped out. They were all men who clearly distinguished between kindness and hatred. In Winston's words, this was how it was for the rest of their lives. Jedis also had no way out. After Nicholas dealt with Lola, he would definitely target the Vatican. Although priests were a profession that took pleasure in helping others, it didn't mean that they didn't have their own grudges. The destruction of the land of faith was more painful than physical injury. Dwight Steele wanted to shine once more in his old age, and he was filled with the desire to rely on the dragon and the phoenix. He didn't want to retreat even more. One after another, for various reasons, the strong walked to Han Jin's side. Before they made their move, no one could have predicted that they would have such terrifying, explosive power. Even Han Jin didn't realize that he had already become the hero of the crowd. At this moment, he was sitting on a chair, quietly thinking. After seeing the military of the Kingdom of Magnificent Light at its peak and knowing how many strong people gathered around Nicholas, he was greatly moved. After returning, he often fell into deep thought. Nicholas had already broken free from his shackles. In just a few short years, he had to find a path that suited him. Chapter 266. Early in the morning was the busiest time in the Reaper mercenary team's base. No matter what they were doing during the day, after waking up, they would always gather together to eat and chat. This had become their habit. Today was the same as usual, but just as everyone was happily chatting, Yelena suddenly rushed in from outside. Yelena had been living in the alchemy laboratory, and Julia hadn't seen her for a few days. She smiled and waved at her. "Yelena, come and sit here." Yelena didn't have time to greet Julia. Instead, she fixed her eyes on Morrison's and asked abruptly, "Morrison's, are you practicing the River of Stars fighting technique?" Yes, what's wrong?" Morrison's felt very strange. Everyone knew that he practiced the River of Stars fighting technique, and Yelena had seen him fight before. It seemed that there was no need for her to ask him specifically. Yelena threw herself at Morrison's and grabbed Morrison's arm. Come with me. I have something to show you." What? Morrison's was a little nervous. Yelena's posture was too intimate. Her whole body was almost sticking to him, and he could even smell the fragrance of her body and hair. "Come, let's talk outside." Yelena pulled Morrison's with all her strength. Morrison's didn't move. He glanced at the people in the room with a pleading look. Then he squeezed out a sentence. "Don't be like this. Sylvia will kill me." Who is Sylvia? Yelena didn't understand. After all, she had only heard of Sylvia's name a few times, and she had long forgotten about it. Leger almost burst out laughing. This guy Morrison's would actually think too highly of himself. Yelena's abnormal attitude meant that something important must have happened, but it definitely had nothing to do with romance. Even if Yelena had fallen in love with Morrison's, in terms of appearance, and various other aspects, Morrison's was not attractive enough. At least, he would not be able to attract Yelena. Leger said in a strange tone, "Sylvia is his fiancée." Fiancée? Yelena was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, she understood why Morrison's was evading her. She was furious. "You bastard! What about me?" Morrison's felt wronged. He was having a good meal when Yelena suddenly barged in and ruined his appetite. Now she was attacking him. How unreasonable! You. Yelena wanted to explain, but she didn't think it was necessary. After a moment of silence, she stomped her foot, turned around, and rushed out of the door. "Yelena, what's the matter?" Han Jin asked softly. Yelena stopped and hesitated for a moment. Then she said, "I have opened Tinos's space ring." "Opened it." The room fell silent. Although Tinos was still young, as the only son of Nicholas, he was definitely the second most important person in the Kingdom of Magnificent Light. Therefore, there was a high chance that he had something very important in his dimensional ring. "What did you find?" Han Jin asked. "I haven't looked at the others, but I found a book about the experience of practicing the Galaxy of Stars fighting technique. I guess that it might be Nicholas's handwriting, so I wanted to show it to Morrison's and see if it was useful." Yelena stared at Morrison's as she spoke. "Where's the notebook?" Morrison's voice trembled slightly. Practicing alone was like a blind man touching an elephant. He had put in a lot of effort, but he didn't get anything in return. This made him feel very helpless. Hearing Yelena's words, Morrison's heart began to beat wildly. Nicholas was practicing the Galaxy of Stars fighting technique, and he had written a notebook for his son. What was recorded in the notebook must be the most important thing. It could be described as a priceless treasure. Yelena didn't pay any attention to Morrison's. Just now, Morrison's had offended her badly. "Where's the notebook?" Han Jin asked. "It's with me." "Let me see." Han Jin reached out his hand. "What? You want to practice fighting power?" Yelena was a little surprised, but she still walked over, took out a very simple notebook from her space ring, and handed it to Han Jin. Han Jin took the notebook and carefully flipped through it. Everyone's eyes were focused on Han Jin, especially Winston, Saxon, and the other warriors. They all looked very nervous. Although they didn't practice the Galaxy of Stars fighting technique, they still had the same goal. If the notebook was really written by Nicholas himself, they could still benefit from it. Jeds didn't hide it from the others. Everyone now knew what kind of strength Nicholas had. He could kill a sword saint of the same level in an instant. Nicholas was infinitely close to the legendary demigod. Who would want to miss the opportunity to learn from the experience written by such a person? As for Morrison's, needless to say, he even wanted to cry. Han Jin flipped through a few pages, and his face became more and more serious. Then he turned to the last page, looked at it for a moment, and handed the notebook to Yelena. "Raphael, how is it?" Morrison's asked hurriedly. "Go and beg for Yelena's forgiveness." Han Jin smiled. "This notebook is very useful to you." "No, it's useful to all warriors." "Yelena." Morrison's eyes turned to Yelena, but he only said one word and didn't know what else to say. Yelena snorted coldly. The notebook was going to be handed over to Morrison's sooner or later, and she hurried over because of Morrison's. But she was in a bad mood. Before she was satisfied, Morrison's could forget about it. "Sasu, you don't have anything to do recently, right?" Han Jin asked. "Me?" Sasu paused. "There are some things I need to do, but I can put them aside for now." "What's the matter?" "Help me copy Nicholas's handwriting and give it to me. It's very useful to me." "Okay, no problem." Sasu nodded. "Then I'll go back first. Maybe there are other important things." Yelena's heart had already flown back to the alchemy laboratory. There were still many things that she hadn't had time to examine. "Take care of your body," Han Jin said softly. "I'm not a child. I know how to take care of myself." Yelena smiled. "I'll go with you." Sasu stood up as well. "Okay," Yelena said. "I'll go too." Morrison stood up as well. Yelena looked at Morrison's from head to toe. Without saying anything, she turned around and walked out. "Be careful not to be struck by lightning," Leger muttered. Morrison's heard Leger's muttering because his face clearly became hesitant. But the desire in his heart overcame his fear, and he walked towards the door resolutely. After a short while, as expected, a few thunderous noises came from outside. Then Moxink walked into the room gloomily and sat down on the chair with a dejected look on his face. Even if she was angry, Yelena wouldn't attack Morrison's with powerful magic. Morrison's combat power was not to be trifled with either. He wasn't injured, but only he knew how he felt. "Morrison's, why are you in such a hurry?" Han Jin smiled. "Yelena is still angry. She'll be fine in a few days." "I know, but Morrison's face was sad. There were some things that couldn't wait until tomorrow. For example, showing a candy to a child and then telling the child to wait a few days before giving it to him. Although the candy would end up in the child's stomach sooner or later, it was too cruel. "Morrison's, what are you thinking?" Leger's face was full of sarcasm. "To be honest, I've never admired someone as much as I do now." "What do you mean?" Morrison stared at him. "I'm saying that I admire you," Leger said. "Why do you think that, Yelena?" Leger didn't know how to say it. If he said too much, it would hurt Morrison's, but if he said too little, it wouldn't be enough to express his meaning. Most of the people in the room were trying hard to hold back their laughter. In fact, everyone liked Yelena. She was the daughter of Grand Duke Solomon. She had status, was a young magus, and had potential. She was also very beautiful. Compared to her, even Gibran's Julia was second-rate. Only Sunir could compete with Yelena. Moreover, Yelena was a person who didn't put on any airs and was always pleasant to everyone. No one believed that Yelena was a famous iceberg beauty in the Magic Academy in the capital of elements. There was nothing annoying about such a girl. However, although they liked her, they knew that there was a huge gap between them. Most of the people in the room were single, and no one had any thoughts about her. This was also the difference between them and the magic students in the Magic Academy. Although the age gap wasn't big, each of them had been through a lot. Not only did they know others, but they also knew themselves clearly. The young magic students couldn't do that. Moreover, the Magic Academy of God's language only recruited nobles, and almost all of them were favored by the heavens. Because they were young and lacked experience, they were easy to dream. Because of their background, because of their confidence, they dared to put their dreams into action. They all thought that they were unique and outstanding, and that they had the hope of winning Yelena's favor. In the end, Yelena was forced to wear a mask. "It's early in the morning, and I'm not awake yet." Morrison's argued with a red face. If a woman suddenly rushed in, hugged you tightly, and wanted to talk to you outside, what would you think? But I would never think that Yelena is interested in me. Leger laughed. Stop arguing. Hanjin stood up slowly. Morrison's, can't you wait a few days? If your goal is always to be a fighter, then pretend that I didn't say anything. If you set your goal very high, if you can't even control your emotions, what can you do? But you want to say that it's Nicolet's note? Hanjin smiled. Today, you can't control yourself because of this, and you even found excuses for yourself. Tomorrow, you will encounter other things that you can't control, and you will find excuses for yourself. I know that you want to find a breakthrough, but if you continue like this, you won't have any future. Listen to me, start now, and start from this. After that, Hanjin walked slowly to the door, opened it, and walked out. Morrison's suddenly fell into silence. He slowly picked up a fork, forked a piece of bread, and put it in his mouth, chewing little by little. Have you noticed that Raphael has changed a lot recently? Julio whispered to Gibran. There were whispers in the room. Obviously, everyone had the same thought. Chapter 267. Outside the encampment, a few slave warriors were already waiting for Hanjin. Sunir had asked Alexander to lead the warriors to support Lang Ning, but Alexander had left behind a few hundred people. Among them, there was a group of about 100 people who were particularly strong. They were all carefully selected by Alexander, and the team captains were all grade 7 fighters. Of course, fighters weren't rare in Mercenary City, but on the battlefield of Komen City, every one of them was an elite warrior. The group of guard was responsible for guarding the encampment of the Reaper mercenary team. When Hanjin and the others had to go out for business, they would automatically send a few people to follow behind them. It wasn't that they had the ability to protect anyone, but if anything happened, at least there would be someone to inform them. This would prevent things from happening like before, where Hanjin and the others were kept in the dark when something had already happened outside. Humans could be very strange sometimes. The mages of Cold Shadow City had installed restraining rings on the slaves. If someone wanted to do something bad, they only needed to use a small spell to wipe out the slave's life. However, the slaves had never stopped resisting. Now that their restraining rings had been removed, if they chose to leave quietly without Alexander here, no one could stop them. However, they had become very obedient and could even be considered loyal. When Alexander left, he did a head count. Including the injured and the injured, there were a total of 425 male warriors left. Now, there were still 425 people. In fact, the relationship between the two parties was a bit unclear. Hanjin was a hands-off manager and almost never interfered with the trivial matters of the outside world. Their food and lodging were still taken care of by the Mercenary Association. There were too many people, so it was inevitable that there would be areas that couldn't be taken care of. The living conditions of the slave warriors weren't good, but even so, no one left. Seeing Hanjin walk out, 2 slave warriors hurriedly jumped onto the carriage. One of the slave warriors respectfully lifted the curtain of the carriage, and the other warrior shouted at the side room, "Hurry up!" Following the shout, 2 female slaves trotted out of the room. One of them was holding a roll of blankets, and the other was holding a porcelain plate. The plate was filled with water bottles, cups, and other things. The other hand was carrying a small square table. The 2 female slaves jumped into the carriage and hurriedly spread the blanket in the carriage. Then, they placed the small square table in the middle of the carriage. They also placed the kettle and cup in the middle of the carriage. Finally, they shrank into the corner. When Hanjin got into the carriage, a soldier jumped onto the coachman's seat and picked up the horsewhip. 4 soldiers held onto the carriage from both sides and hung on the outside of the carriage. Then the carriage slowly drove out of the courtyard. Hanjin chose a comfortable position and sat down. One of the female slaves leaned forward, but when she saw that Hanjin didn't want to drink, she quietly shrank back. Hanjin wasn't used to being served by others, and he had talked to Sasu about it. However, Sasu said that this large group of people depended on them for a living. Although the Mercenary Association was temporarily in charge of them, they would have to pay for it sooner or later. It was only right to let the slaves do what they could. Otherwise, they would suffer too much. In the end, Hanjin chose to let nature take its course. The leaders of the Chamber of Commerce and the presidents of the Mercenary Association all had a lot of slaves at home. This kind of thing was very normal. After a while, the carriage drove out of isolated Cliff City. Following a small path, it wobbled for 7 or 8 miles and gradually approached a forest. This forest was a little strange. Other than the trees and bushes, there were statues that were about the size of a human. There were even more statues than trees. When the carriage was still a few hundred meters away, a few statues suddenly came to life. A sharp cry echoed in the forest. Then, the statues opened their blood-red eyes one after another. Then, they spread their wings and flew into the sky, closing in on the carriage. The slave warriors seemed to have seen this kind of scene many times. Their expressions didn't change as they continued to drive the carriage forward. A wave of magic came from the depths of the forest. The gargoyles that were rushing up circled in the air, then flew back to their original positions and turned back into statues, never to move again. Not long after, Hogan walked out of the forest. With a squeak, the carriage stopped in front of Hogan. Hanjin got out of the carriage and looked around. "Master, you're early," Hogan said with a smile. "Only the early bird gets the worm." Hanjin smiled. "How's it going?" "Well," Hogan hesitated. "Master, I've recruited almost all the carpenters in the city. They're working hard every day and night. But the thing you want is too big. I estimate that it'll take at least a month." "That won't do." Hanjin shook his head. "I don't know if my method will work. If it can be done in half a month, even if it's wrong, I'll have enough time to correct it. If it drags on for a month, it's too late. Come, take me to see it." "Master, this way." Hogan looked at Hanjin timidly, then turned and walked into the forest. In fact, he really wasn't slacking off. As long as it was something Hanjin asked him to do, he would do his best. But this time, the work was too big. Even if he supervised day and night, the results were barely satisfactory. In the middle of the forest, a large open space had been cleared out. It was about 1 kilometer in radius. Hundreds of carpenters were busy working on a huge object. From afar, it looked like a huge ship, but its shape was somewhat strange. The bottom was flat, and the area of the upper and lower parts were the same. This didn't conform to the most basic concept of shipbuilding. Hogan led Hanjin onto the plank. The ship was about 200 meters long and 40 meters wide, but it was only 20 meters tall. The proportions were somewhat imbalanced. Because it wasn't finished, there was nothing on the plank. It was empty, like a small square. "Master, there's something I don't know if I should ask," Hogan whispered. "Go ahead," Hanjin answered as he looked around. "Master, what you want me to build is a ship. Something like that. But what's the use of building a ship here?" After getting a clear answer, Hogan became even more confused. "Master, we can't just drive a ship through the forest, right? Have you ever been to the Little U Bar?" Hanjin said with a smile. "Huh, of course I have. Master, I didn't know that you and I have the same." Hogan suddenly shut his mouth. The smile he showed when he met someone who understood him disappeared in an instant. One was the master, and the other was the slave. He couldn't speak carelessly. "Why do you think the business of the Little U Bar is so good?" "Because the barmaids there are very sexy and busty." Hogan saw that Hanjin was a bit dissatisfied, so he added, feels this. "What about the Star of Snowy Night Bar? Why is their business so good?" "You been to the Star of Snowy Night Bar too?" Hogan couldn't control himself anymore. He grinned and said, "Because the barmaids there are very pure. How should I put it? They're like those innocent girls in the countryside. If they walked out of the bar and onto the street, no one would believe that they were barmaids. There are hundreds of bars in isolated Cliff City. Which ones have the best business? Of course, it's the Little U and the Star of Snowy Night. Why? Because the barmaids are very good, unlike other places where there are all kinds of bad women." "Are they only very good?" "The barmaids of the Little U and the Star of Snowy Night Bar are different. Why are their businesses so good?" Hogan frowned and thought for a while. He asked tentatively, "Because they all have their own specialties?" "Specialties are actually advantages." Hanjin said softly, "No matter what business it is, there will always be people who lose money and go bankrupt. There are also people who make a lot of money. There's a reason for this. Hogan nodded confusedly. He could understand what Han Jin was saying, but he didn't understand what business had to do with the ship they were building. This thing is our specialties. Or rather, I will try my best to make it our specialties. Han Jin smiled and stomped on the deck of the ship. Hogan, I think it's almost finished. Why do you say it still needs a month? Master, for such a big ship, you'll need a few sturdy masts. I haven't found any materials to make masts yet, and the cabin hasn't been built yet. There's also the sail. I heard from the carpenters that we need to put some oil on the deck. Otherwise, the deck won't be able to withstand the wind, sun, or waves. Idiot. Han Jin laughed. Do you really think I want to build a ship? Then, Hogan asked blankly. In fact, he was very happy. Although Han Jin called him an idiot, his tone was very intimate. He really hoped that Han Jin would use the same tone to call him a few more times. Han Jin walked slowly on the deck of the ship. After a while, he walked along the side of the ship and nodded. Not bad, Hogan. You've done well. I thought it would take at least half a month. Now it seems that it will only take 2 more days. 2 days? Impossible, Master. If I say it's possible, then it's possible. Han Jin turned around. Hogan, tell the carpenters to fill up all the holes. That's for the mast and the cabin. Do as I say. Han Jin thought for a moment. In short, you need to make the deck as smooth as a mirror. Do you understand? Don't worry about anything else. Leave the rest to me. Han Jin nodded. Right? How many cabins are there below? Big and small. There are about 180 cabins. There are 3 levels. That's enough. Han Jin smiled. Let's do it this way. Tomorrow, let the carpenters leave. However, you have to stay here. You don't have to worry about anything in the city. You and your gargoyles must look after my ship. Master, how can I do that? There's still many things to do. I've said before. Leave the rest to me. Han Jin said softly. Tomorrow night, you'll understand. Chapter 268. Under the bright, starry sky, a lonely giant ship was anchored there quietly. There was not a single person to be seen in the vast open space. There was no need for guards here. Hogan, a great magician, commanded thousands of gargoyles, which were more than enough to deal with an ordinary attack. Moreover, this place was very close to isolated Cliff City. If there was even the slightest abnormality, Han Jin, riding on a sword light, could rush over in a flash. The planks of the ship that looked like a small square had been repaired, leaving only 8 entrances. According to Hogan's calculations, the more than 180 cabins below were enough to accommodate thousands of people. If there were too few entrances, it would be too inconvenient to go in and out. There was a chair in the middle of the spacious planks, and Han Jin was sitting on it. Hogan stood beside Han Jin, looking around anxiously. Harley was standing on the other side. Today, Harley was a little abnormal. In the past, he had spent most of his time hiding in the soul-devouring orb and could only communicate with Cromwell's remnant soul. After a long time, he had thoroughly understood Cromwell. He had even asked about Cromwell's childhood sweets and how he had broken other people's windows. In his own words, it was really boring. Therefore, whenever Han Jin let him out, he would always talk endlessly. It didn't matter if it was nonsense or if there was anyone listening. As long as he could talk, he would feel happy. But at this moment, Harley was unusually quiet. As the spirit of the soul-devouring orb, if Han Jin didn't want to hide anything from him, he and Han Jin could communicate telepathically. Everything was because he knew what Han Jin wanted to do. About 10 meters in front of Han Jin, there was a pile of large and small wooden blocks, as well as a dozen or so Tran corpses. In fact, those wooden blocks were cut from the trance. With Han Jin's current progress, the wooden commander seal was no longer useful. He should have thrown away the Trant corpses, but Han Jin was used to living a poor life. In that world, any kind of treasure was rare, so he was reluctant to part with it. He didn't expect that it would come in handy today. He also spent a lot of money to buy a lot of Trant corpses, which should be enough. Midnight arrived. At the moment when yin and yang alternated between heaven and earth, Han Jin suddenly stood up. His movement startled Hogan. Han Jin had been sitting on the chair for a few hours. Hogan even thought that Hanjin had fallen asleep, but Harley, who always liked to use sarcastic words, didn't say anything. Harley, who was very quiet, to talk. Rise! Hanjin shouted loudly. His voice was like a thunderclap that rolled over the woods. Then, he quickly formed a series of hand gestures, but his ruddy face quickly turned pale. Just one spell had almost exhausted all of his vital energy. Go! Hanjin shouted again. With a wave of his hand, a huge ball of light shot into the sky and exploded, illuminating the sky. The originally clear night sky suddenly darkened. Pieces of faintly discernible clouds condensed at the place where the light ball exploded. Soon, the clouds became denser and denser, even covering half the sky. Finally, it formed a huge whirlpool, and the whirlpool was still spinning slowly. Hanjin's body staggered. He immediately used the spirit refreshment spell on himself. However, the spirit refreshment spell could only make up for the loss of physical strength. It couldn't eliminate the feeling of weakness caused by the rapid loss of vital energy. Hanjin felt very uncomfortable, but at this moment, he couldn't care about anything else. What Hanjin released was the Thunder Tribulation refining spell. If a blacksmith wanted to make a good weapon, he needed a pure furnace fire that could maintain a constant high temperature. He also needed to forge it repeatedly. In fact, it was the same for cultivators. Using the 3 true fire to refine magic weapons was a very common method. In the ancient times, those tyrannical self-cultivators disdained to use the 3 true flames. They would directly trigger the tribulation thunder to refine their own weapons. The former could only refine magical treasures, while the latter could refine immortal weapons. However, Hanjin's vital energy was too little. His realm was still very far away from the realm of Tai. Although he had made all kinds of preparations in advance and spent an entire afternoon to set up a large formation, and although he had almost exhausted all of his vital energy, what he could trigger in the end was only a single thunder tribulation. Nobody knew when, but the night wind floating in the forest inexplicably disappeared. Between heaven and earth, it suddenly became very quiet. It was so quiet that the 3 people on the deck could even hear their own heartbeats. Hogan murmured. He wanted to say something, but he didn't dare to open his mouth and break the silence. He felt a pressure that seeped into his bones, just like the legendary dragon aura. The sky suddenly lit up, and a dazzling bolt of lightning pierced through the eye of the clouds and smashed straight down. All lightning magic, due to the instability of the electric arc, was divergent in appearance. For example, the 9-grid Thunder Call spell released by Yelena would produce hundreds of messy forks for each lightning pillar that fell from the sky. However, this bolt of lightning was exceptionally clear and neat, like a giant that stood tall and upright, thrusting its weapon downwards. Hogan was stunned for a moment, and all the hair on his body stood up. Although the bolt of lightning hadn't struck yet, he clearly felt that it contained an unstoppable attack power, and the target of the bolt of lightning was clearly the giant ship under their feet. Hogan screamed, "Master, be careful." Then he waved his hand and released an icicle to meet the bolt of lightning. "Don't mess around," Harley shouted angrily. His voice was very dignified, and compared to his usual self, it gave people a feeling of incompatibility. Hanjin stretched out his hand, and the corpses of the tree demons and the wooden blocks of various sizes suddenly rose up and gathered into an irregular sphere. The Samadhi true fire was not an ordinary fire, and the tribulation thunder was not an ordinary thunder. The icicle released by Hogan didn't have any effect on the tribulation thunder, and it inexplicably passed through it. The next moment, the tribulation thunder had hit the corpses of the tree demons. With a loud bang, the corpses of the tree demons and the wooden blocks of various sizes were all shattered in an instant, turning into tiny specks of light that were countless times smaller than dust and sprinkled down. With the sound of rolling thunder, the tribulation cloud that covered half of the sky quickly dissipated, and the night sky became clear again. This is... Hogan was tongue-tied. He didn't expect that such a terrifying bolt of lightning would not cause any damage to the giant ship, and that the magic he released had no effect. He couldn't understand it no matter how he thought about it. Han Jin revealed a happy expression. Ignoring his weak state, he forcefully formed a hand seal. The tiny specks of light suddenly became alive and spread out along the deck of the ship. Soon, the entire giant ship was covered by the specks of light. "Let's go down and take a look," Han Jin said in a low voice. "Hogan, are you blind? Why aren't you supporting the Lord?" Harley screamed. Hogan was stunned and hurriedly ran a few steps to support Han Jin's arm. Han Jin was very clear that what he should do now was to immediately find a quiet place to regulate his breathing, but he couldn't be at ease. Without seeing the results, he wasn't in the mood to do anything. Following the wooden ladder, the three of them walked down to the first floor of the cabin. Hogan was shocked to see that not only was the deck of the ship covered by the specks of light, but also the inside, including the wooden ladder, including the doors. There were flickering specks of light everywhere. Han Jin casually pushed open a door, looked inside, and then nodded with satisfaction. "Let's go down." Han Jin only let out a sigh of relief after walking all the way to the bottom floor. "Let me go. I want to rest here for a while." Hogan carefully supported Han Jin to sit on the floor. He looked around and squatted down to touch the wooden planks. In the past, they were all ordinary wood, but the quality was not bad. But now, he could clearly feel a lively aura, full of vitality. After observing for a long time, Hogan couldn't help but whisper, "Master, what's going on?" Han Jin smiled and took out a long sword from his interspatial ring. He had released thousand-layered waves some time ago and destroyed a flying sword, so he needed to refine more flying swords to replenish it. Moreover, with his vital energy, he could release more than 10,000 layered waves consecutively. Of course, he had to make sufficient preparations, but he hadn't had the time to refine them yet. Han Jin threw the sword to the ground. "Take the sword and find a place to chop a few times." Hogan picked up the long sword and looked at Han Jin in a daze. Seeing Han Jin nod with a smile, he turned and walked to the door. This place didn't matter. He could just replace the door after destroying it. Hogan looked at Han Jin again, then raised the sword and chopped at the door with all his strength. The countless specks of light suddenly shot out a dazzling light. Hogan only felt a huge force coming from his wrist. He couldn't hold it anymore, and the long sword flew out of his hand. His body also staggered a few steps back and almost fell to the ground. Hogan was an expert in alchemy. Even Yelena would ask him for advice if she had any questions. He immediately understood that Han Jin had used a magical spell to turn the entire ship into a magic prop. Hogan rushed forward at a speed that didn't match his age and carefully touched the door. The place he had just chopped was still as smooth as a mirror, without a single flaw. "Master, can I release magic?" Hogan turned his head in surprise and joy. "Yes." Han Jin paused. "But don't use fire magic, and don't use powerful magic." "Can't resist fire magic?" Hogan hurriedly said. "Master, then if the enemy attacks us with fire magic, what should we do?" "This is only the first step." Han Jin smiled. "Now that my magic has been exhausted, I can only rest tomorrow. From now on, I will come here every other day. About 2 months should be enough." He hated that he had too little vital energy. Even if he exhausted his vital energy here every other day, he would only be able to complete the first step of the plan in 2 months. "But, Master, this ship can't move on the ground. Why are you wasting so much effort? What if this ship can fly in the sky?" Harley let out a strange laugh. "Fly in the sky? How is that possible?" Hogan cried. "Nothing is impossible," Han Jin said lightly. This. Hogan was stunned for a moment, then suddenly jumped up and shouted incoherently, "Master! Oh my God! Oh my God! I need magic crystal cannons. The more the better." Hogan was a magician who had participated in the battle of a large legion, so he immediately realized the power of this ship. Of course, if what Han Jin said could be realized. "Don't worry, everything will be there." Han Jin closed his eyes. "Now, you two stay quiet for a while." Chapter 269. Deep in the abyss, in the depths of the vampire's lair, Alquite's appearance stunned all the vampires. Who would have thought that Tim could really summon their ancestor? The bottom of the huge cave instantly became silent. Alquite was a godlike existence to these low-level vampires. Thousands of bats hung on the walls of the cave, not daring to even breathe loudly. Alquite glanced at Tim, who was lying beside the magic circle on the verge of death. The wound on Tim's wrist was no longer bleeding. Although he had fainted, the vampire's recovery ability was still faithfully repairing his body. Children. Alquite's old voice echoed in the cave. Who can tell me what happened? Soon, the vampires pushed Cayman out. Since he was the first one to come in contact with Tim, he was eloquent enough. Of course, the most important thing was that Betty's death was bad news. What if the ancestor heard the news and got angry? No one was willing to bear the wrath of their ancestor. It could very well mean losing their life. Therefore, Cayman unfortunately took on this task. It was obvious that he was not very popular. These damn bastards. Cayman cursed the other vampires in his heart. But cursing was one thing. Since he had been pushed out, he could only bite the bullet. Otherwise, he might die even more miserably. Cayman mustered up his courage and flew down from the cave wall. He transformed into his human form and respectfully knelt in front of Alquite. His mother was killed on the surface, so he came back to the abyss to wake you up. Why didn't you stop him? Don't you know that his bloodline is not pure? Alquite said unhappily. In fact, if it wasn't for Victor's yelling, he wouldn't have come up at all. He would have just let this unlucky bastard bleed to death. He wasn't a pure vampire anyway. Even if he was his own descendant, he wouldn't feel bad at all. Seeing that this ancestor's tone was a little unfriendly, a layer of cold sweat appeared on Carmen's forehead. He secretly hated the unconscious Tim in his heart. Why did he have to cause so much trouble, causing him to be implicated as well? His mother has some status in the family, and we have no reason to stop him. Cayman stuttered nervously. What is his mother's name? Alquite stroked his chin, and a fierce light flashed in his eyes. He made up his mind. If it was one of his insignificant descendants, he would definitely make this unlucky bastard who dared to wake him up pay the price. However, should he wake this bastard up and then kill him? Or should he just let him disappear? Just as Alquite was thinking about how to make his move, he heard Cayman say, "His mother is Betty." Betty. Alquite's hand paused. The Betty who has the gift of foresight? Yes. He was very nervous. If the ancestor knew Betty's name, then there must be some connection between the two of them. How did she get involved with humans? Alquite asked in surprise. Carmen then recounted how Zagund had come to the abyss and how he had taken Betty and her subordinates away when he returned to the surface. Alquite listened carefully to Cayman's words and pondered for a while before asking, "Didn't you say that the person who took Betty away was a lord? How come he didn't even have the ability to avenge Betty?" I don't know. Maybe humans are unreliable. If what you said is true, then this bastard is still useful. Alquite calculated in his heart. How long had it been since he went to the surface? Humans, elves, and the prosperous world. These things were so exciting when he thought about them. Maybe it was time for him to go to the surface. Alquite thought as he looked at Tim, who was still unconscious. He gave up on the idea of killing this impure descendant. Cayman didn't know what the ancestor was thinking, so he didn't dare to say anything. He could only kneel there quietly. At this time, a few bats descended from the top of the cave and turned into their human forms as they approached the ground. They knelt in front of Alquite. Alquite looked at them with a smile on his face. "Little fellas, you're quite fast." The leader of the group, a middle-aged man, had a slightly awkward look on his face. It was really embarrassing to be called a little one in front of so many juniors. However, he didn't dare to say anything because the man in front of him did have the right to call him that. The beautiful woman kneeling behind the middle-aged man raised her head and smiled. "You're awake. Even if we have something important to do, we still have to come and welcome you." "What's there to welcome?" Alquite waved his hand. "Go do what you need to do. I'm not that prideful guy like Victor." The middle-aged man's face became even more awkward. As a descendant of Victor, he had to protect Victor's dignity with his life. However, facing Alquit, one of the longest living leaders of the Blood Clan, he didn't dare to complain. Otherwise, even if Victor was here, he wouldn't be able to save his life. Alquit seemed to have just noticed the middle-aged man kneeling in front of him. He walked over and patted the middle-aged man's head. "Alux, I didn't expect you to be an elder already. TSK. Victor finally has a decent descendant. It's really not easy." Alux's face was bitter. He couldn't say anything at all. "Let's go. If you have nothing to do, then accompany me to the meeting room." It seemed that Alquit was in a good mood and didn't continue to make things difficult for him. Alux couldn't help but secretly sigh in relief. He knew very well that this leader loved to tease people. "Right, little one, wake this unlucky guy up and then come to the meeting room to find me," Alquit said to Cayman. Cayman nodded subconsciously. He only reacted after Alquit and the vampire elders had flown away. How could he wake Tim up? There was only one way, and that was blood. Cayman suddenly felt that his head was about to explode. Cayman was 100% unwilling to sacrifice his blood for Tim. However, he had to carry out the ancestors' words. What should he do? Cayman's gaze fell on the bats hanging on the cave wall. His eyes couldn't help but light up. These damn bastards, they didn't have any loyalty and pushed him out. It was time for them to receive their retribution. You, and you. Cayman stood there proudly and casually pointed at a few vampires. "All of you come down. Didn't you hear what the ancestor said? We have to wake this unlucky guy up." "Why? That's what the ancestor ordered you to do. What does it have to do with us?" The vampires who were called out all expressed their objections. Cayman looked at the vampires with a smile. "Since you say so, then I'll go and tell the ancestor that this has nothing to do with you. I just don't know how he will react." The vampires had no choice but to fly down. None of them dared to take such a risk. "Cayman, you can't just watch us do the work, right?" one of the young men said in a muffled voice. "What do you think? When you pushed me out just now, you should have thought of the consequences." Cayman was still smiling. He was feeling exceptionally good inside. "You dare trick me? Then you'll have to pay the price." The vampires looked at each other, but there was nothing they could do about Cayman. He was using the ancestor's name. Who would dare to say no? They could only obediently transfuse their blood into Tim one by one. To the vampires, blood was the best medicine. After a while, Tim woke up. When he opened his eyes, he was puzzled as he looked at the vampires beside him. Using one's own blood to heal a fellow vampire was something that had never happened before, but it shouldn't have happened to him. After all, there wasn't a single vampire close to him in the vampire's lair. Otherwise, why would they watch him perform the ritual to awaken the ancestor alone? "Our young master has woken up." Cayman squatted beside Tim. "Why? Aren't you going to thank me? I asked them to transfuse their blood into you." Tim sat up slowly. "Although I don't know why, I still have to thank you. Let's go. You're a big shot now. The ancestor is waiting for you." "Ancestor?" Tim was stunned. He then remembered the dazzling white light he saw before he fainted. Did he really succeed in awakening the ancestor? That's right. That's why I say you're lucky. Not only did you not die during the ritual, you even succeeded in awakening the ancestor. Your contribution this time is huge. Cayman looked at Tim enviously. In the past, if the ancestor was in a good mood, he wouldn't be stingy with his rewards. Of course, he didn't know that if Alquit hadn't wanted to go to the surface to take a look, the unlucky Tim would have been a dead man long ago. When Tim and Cayman arrived at the meeting hall, Alquit was sitting at the head of the table and talking to a few vampire elders. Tim and Cayman bowed respectfully and carefully stood to the side. There was no place for them to sit. It could even be said that ordinary low-level vampires didn't even have the right to enter. "Little guy, your mother is Betty?" Alquit asked kindly. "Yes," Tim replied carefully. Alquit sighed. "I remember the last time I went into hibernation. Betty was only a little girl. I didn't expect her son to be so big already." Tim was stunned for a moment. Then he was overjoyed. The ancestor actually knew his mother. It seemed like there was hope for revenge. After Tim finished telling the whole story, Alquite's expression was a little strange. You mean Betty and Caroline both died in the hands of that young man? Yes, I heard that that person had a lot of prestige in isolated Cliff City, Tim said. A young man in his 20s has such power? I don't really believe it. What about you guys? Alquite asked the elders around him. The elders looked at each other and shook their heads. They would rather believe that Betty and Caroline died in the enemy's trap than believe that a young human could kill them face to face. But Tim still wanted to argue. Don't worry, child. No matter who killed them, they will pay the price. Alquite interrupted Tim. It seems like I have to go to the surface. Tim knelt on the ground gratefully. As long as you can avenge my mother, I will do anything. Alquite laughed. All right, child. I know you're a good person. From the fact that you dared to do the awakening ceremony alone, I can see how determined you are. The vampire elders beside him all stood up. Electrolux said, Leader, let us go with you. What a joke. Alquite gently stroked his neat, white hair. It's just a young boy. Do we need to go all out? You are right. Electrolux smiled apologetically, but there was a trace of worry in his eyes. Alquite glanced at Electrolux and laughed. What? Are you afraid that I won't be able to distinguish the situation on the surface after sleeping for hundreds of years? I wouldn't dare. We are very clear about your abilities. Not to mention the people on the ground. Even those old fellows in the abyss would flee as far as they could if they knew that you were awake. Electrolux hurriedly tried to suck up to Lindley. Alquite laughed. You don't have to flatter me. I'm not an old fool. I am far from being able to do whatever I want on the surface. However, Alquite stopped smiling and straightened his body. I am here to avenge my children. I would like to see who dares to stop me. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 270. When Han Jin returned to the Reaper mercenary team's encampment, the sky was already bright. Although he had rested for a while, Han Jin still felt exhausted. What he wanted to do most now was to go back to his bed, ignore everything, and sleep comfortably. Opening the door, Han Jin couldn't help but be stunned. Sunir was lying on his bed, lazily playing with a little golden thunderbird. The little thunderbird was the one that was almost trampled to death by Morrisons. As the saying goes, one who survives a great disaster is bound to have good fortune in the future. Its fate was decided during Han Jin and Han Jin's conversation, and Han Jin chose it to be the king of the Thunderbirds. Under Han Jin's special care, the little Thunderbird grew very fast. Its originally fat body gradually became longer, and it had a streamlined beauty. Now, the little Thunderbird was still in its infancy, but its size and weight were comparable to an ordinary eagle. Why are you here? Han Jin said a very meaningless sentence. Fortunately, Sunir was not a sentimental person. Otherwise, she would definitely think too much. Waiting for you. Sunir rolled her eyes at Han Jin. Where did you go the whole night? Didn't I tell you that I had something to do? I might not be able to come back tonight. Han Jin said as he sat on the bed. You said you wouldn't come back, and you didn't even tell others what you were doing. Everyone was worried about you. What could I have to do? Han Jin smiled. Don't worry. If I wanted to run away, no one on this continent could stop me. After saying that, Han Jin lazily laid down on the bed. He really needed a rest. Sunir wanted to say something, but when she looked at Han Jin, she sighed softly and said nothing. Han Jin's heart skipped a beat. He realized that he had been neglecting Sunir for the past few days. In fact, he was also helpless. After all, a person's energy was limited. He wanted to improve his strength and prepare for his future confrontation with Nicholas. There were many things that he had to do, and he didn't have the time to hide in a corner with Sunir. This was also the common helplessness of many people who had achieved something or wanted to achieve something. No matter what industry one was in, one had to pay a price to make a name for oneself. No one's success could be completely dependent on luck. Of course, those who hid in the shadows of their ancestors did not count. Time, energy, sweat, and so on. It was because they had put in far more effort than others that they could become the best. It was also because of this that they would neglect some things that they should not neglect. For example, lovers. However, it was difficult to have the best of both worlds. There was only so much time in a day and a person's energy. If he spent too much time on one side, he would naturally spend less time on the other side. It was unimaginable that a man who spent all his time around his wife and children would have any achievements. Why did you bring Jean Lay out? Han Jean had nothing to say. Jean Lay was the name of the little Thunderbird. They are still young. We have to lock them up and train their wild nature. How do we lock them up? Haven't we always locked them up in the backyard? Little Jean Lay can already fly. How can we lock them up? Do we have to lock them up in a cage? Sunir rolled her eyes again. They can fly. Han Jean was surprised and happy at the same time. He didn't know if it understood the conversation between Han Jean and Sunir, but the little Jean Lay let out a crisp chirp. Then it spread out its wings and flapped it a few times. There was a sudden gust of wind in the room. Even a half-closed window was pushed open. Sunir's elegant long hair was immediately messed up. What was even more pitiful was that she was wearing light gauze pajamas. She couldn't withstand the strong wind and almost exposed her chest. In this day and age, there was no such thing as covering or not covering. Once it was opened, everything would be exposed. This little rascal, Sunir scolded and hurriedly tried to cover her exposed chest. Sunir's scolding was very loud. The little Jean Lay felt that something was wrong. It folded its wings and moved a few steps towards Han Jin's direction, avoiding Sunir. Don't scare it. Han Jin laughed. He reached out to grab Sunir's shoulder and fell backwards. Sunir screamed as she was pulled down by Han Jin. She couldn't help but lean on Han Jin. Do you want to call everyone here? Han Jin said in a low voice. You, don't mess around. Sunir struggled as she anxiously said, The window is open. I won't mess around. Just stay with me for a while. Han Jin closed his eyes slightly. After waiting for a while and seeing that Han Jin didn't move, Sunir stood up and looked at Han Jin. Women's thoughts were just that strange. When Han Jin pulled her down, she was shocked, embarrassed, and scared. But now that Han Jin didn't move, she felt a bit uncomfortable. Raphael, what's wrong? Sunir asked softly. She just realized that Han Jin's condition wasn't right. Tired. Too tired. Han Jin murmured. Releasing the thunder refining spell not only consumed almost all of his vital energy, but he also had to use his mind to control the thunder. He overdrafted too much. Now it was like he had a hangover. His head hurt, and he didn't even want to move his fingers, let alone do anything. He had the heart and courage to do it, but he really didn't have the strength to do it. Sunir saw that Han Jin couldn't even open his eyes. She sighed and leaned on Han Jin's shoulder. Then she remembered something and whispered, Raphael, I have something to tell you. Say it. Isn't your magic able to transform these Thunderbirds? But can it increase the lifespan of the Thunderbirds? Why? The Thunderbird's infancy is only half a year. They grow fast and age fast. At most 6 or 7 years, they won't be able to fly in the sky anymore. Can you think of a way? Sunir bit her lips. 6 or 7 years will pass in the blink of an eye. I can't bear to. If Han Jin opened his eyes at this moment, he would definitely see Sunir's abnormality. Han Jin was so tired, Sunir shouldn't be pestering Han Jin at this time. The matter of the little Thunderbirds could be put aside for later. Her question must have its own meaning. I'll try. Han Jin answered vaguely. Then his finger gently patted Sunir's waist. Sunir's eyes suddenly flashed with sadness, but immediately became firm. She leaned on Han Jin's side again. After waiting for Han Jin for an entire night, she was tired and sleepy. She originally wanted to accompany Han Jin for a while before returning to her room, but after a while, she and Han Jin fell asleep at almost the same time. Little Gold Lightning called out a few times in a low voice. Seeing that no one was paying attention to it, it simply jumped down and obediently laid down at the end of the bed. Its pair of round eyes slowly closed. The window, The dam window that was blown open by little gold lightning was still open. Sunir planned to close it when she went back, but she was powerless now. Early in the morning was the busiest time. Everyone would gather together to eat, talk about yesterday's events, and talk about today's goal. The atmosphere was very intimate and warm. Han Jin said that he was going out last night and didn't come back. Everyone was a little uneasy. Morrison's took the initiative to go to Han Jin's courtyard to see what was going on. In the end, he saw a shocking scene from the window. In the entire team, the most heartless person was Morrison's. It was fine if he smiled knowingly. Of course, it didn't matter how far his smile was from the truth. However, Morrison's was different. It was as if he had seen the avatar of a god. He jumped out and told everyone what he saw in a big fuss. He even called for everyone to go take a look. Luckily, Julia was there. Under her stern reprimand, everyone in the hall obediently sat back down on their chairs. Then, Julia hurried to Han Jin's courtyard, closed the windows, and ordered a few slave warriors to guard the gate and not let anyone in. However, no matter how powerful a person was, he couldn't become the center of the world. Han Jin fell asleep, but the whole world and everyone was still operating according to their own predetermined paths. On the official road hundreds of miles away, a dozen knights were sweating profusely as they desperately urged their horses to gallop towards isolated Cliff City. They were carrying a letter for help personally written by General Lang Ning. Standing behind Lang Ning was the once all-powerful dragon knight, Guevara. Even Guevara couldn't solve the problem and had to ask for help from isolated Cliff City. It wasn't hard to imagine how difficult the problem was. In the dark abyss, a dense swarm of bats flew in a frenzy. The one flying at the front was a silver-white giant bat, Alquit. In fact, although Betty was his descendant, they were separated by several generations, and there was almost no affection between them. However, Alquit had been sleeping underground for too long, and he wanted to go out and relax. Sometimes, ignorance was bliss. If Alquit knew that there was a powerful archbishop beside Han Jin, would he still have the courage to continue flying to the surface? In fact, the priests were only a supporting force and couldn't determine the outcome of a battle. The reason why the Holy See had such a high status was that the priests had displayed great combat power in the war against the Abyssal race. To the Abyssal race, light magic could cause fatal damage to them. Jed's didn't have the highest status in the Holy See, and he wasn't the strongest either. After all, there was the Pope above him. However, when it came to magic, no one could compare with him. Jed's had already created a completely different field. The emergence of cascading magic would definitely, completely change the existing magic system. In the back of a quaint shop in isolated Cliff City, a few elves were sitting there and discussing something in low voices. Although they looked very young, each of them was wearing a purple robe. The famous great elf Lydia was standing behind them with her hands behind her back. For the elves, purple represented nobility and mystery. Only the elders of the Elder Council could wear purple robes. Even Lydia wasn't qualified to wear such a robe. "Lydia, what do you think?" One of the male elders turned around and asked. "Sir, isn't this a bit inappropriate?" Lydia hesitated for a moment and replied softly. "What's wrong with it? We need peace, and we love peace. Anyone who wants to subvert the peace is our enemy." Another female elf said coldly. Lydia didn't speak anymore and slowly lowered her head. For hundreds of years, she had been the vanguard of Wild Willow City. Such high-sounding words couldn't fool her. She knew what the so-called peace was. Chapter 271. It wasn't until dusk that Han Jin slowly woke up. Sunir had already left, but little gold lightning was still there. The Thunderbird was an athlete in the sky, but to little gold lightning, this soft bed was a trap. The Thunderbird's claws were very sharp, and they could easily pierce through the sheets and blankets. However, it was easy to pierce through them, but difficult to pull them out. The end of the bed was almost torn to shreds by little gold lightning, but its claws were still tightly bound by countless threads. Every few days, Han Jin would add a spirit bee sacrifice to little gold lightning. Now, little gold lightning already had a bit of intelligence, and it knew that Han Jin was resting. Otherwise, it would have already started to struggle. Seeing Han Jin sit up, little gold lightning let out a happy chirp. It flapped its wings and rushed towards Han Jin, completely forgetting what it had been fighting against for the entire day. In the end, just as it took a step forward, its head landed on the bed. "Don't move." Han Jin grabbed little gold lightning's wings and pulled it up, only to find that little gold lightning's claws were stuck in a mattress, and the mattress was already torn to the point that it couldn't be any more torn. "No wonder Sunir said you were a bad guy." Han Jin was angry and amused at the same time. At the same time, he felt a bit emotional. Little gold lightning had torn the sheets to this extent, but he didn't know anything. No matter how tired he was, he shouldn't have lost his alertness. This wasn't good, and he had to be more careful in the future. Han Jin pulled out all the threads from Goldbolt's claws, then placed it on the ground. He bent down and put on his combat boots. He had slept with his clothes on yesterday, so he didn't need to tidy himself up. He only needed to tidy himself up. "Let's go. I'll take you out for a walk." Han Jin waved his hand. Little gold lightning was overjoyed. When Han Jin opened the door, it had already snuck out from the crack in the door. It spread its wings and played around in the yard. Little gold lightning could really fly, but its movements were very irregular. One moment, it would float up, and the next moment, it would fall to the ground. It would sway left and right, stumbling around. "Stop fooling around. Come here." As Han Jin spoke, he pushed open the courtyard door and saw several slave warriors standing outside. He asked in surprise, "Why are you here?" "Lady Julia sent us here," one of the slave warriors hurriedly replied. "Oh." Han Jin was a little puzzled, but he didn't take it to heart. He walked slowly to the dining room. After sleeping for an entire day, he was indeed hungry. There were about 7 or 8 people in the restaurant. Morrison's, Gibran, Kane, Winston, and the others were all there. They were happily discussing something, but when they saw Han Jin walk in, they all shut their mouths. "What are you talking about? Why are you so happy?" Han Jin said naturally. Then he turned his gaze to a female slave at the side door. "Go and tell the kitchen to make me a bowl of wheat soup." "Yes, sir." The female slave bowed and flashed through the door. In this world, wheat soup was considered Han Jin's invention. When comparing the two worlds, there were many similarities, but there were also many differences. For example, this world was extremely lacking in valuable herbs. When he first went to the Magic Beast Forest, he hoped that he would be able to find some ginseng. In the end, he didn't even see ginseng leaves, let alone ginseng. Also, this world didn't have rice. Although Han Jin was a cultivator who entered the Tao through eating, his eating habits had long been formed. He couldn't eat bread and jerky early in the morning. In the end, he had to personally teach a few female slaves how to make pearl and jade soup, which was actually noodle soup. As for the difference between the taste and porridge, there was nothing he could do. He just had to deal with it. Sooner or later, he would get used to it. Gibran, Winston, and the others winked at each other. It seemed that they all had something to say, but none of them wanted to be the first to speak. In the end, they all focused on Moxink. Moxink's identity and personality would help him to get away with the crime. If Han Jin got angry, they would be able to smooth things over by saying that Moxink had made a mistake again, and Han Jin wouldn't be serious with Moxink. Morrison's pointed at his nose with his big finger and mouthed something, but no sound came out. "Me?" Gibran and the others hurriedly nodded. Morrison's couldn't help but scratch his head. In fact, he was also a little scared. The side door opened, and a female slave walked in with a big bowl. She walked to Han Jin's side and gently placed the bowl on the table. So fast. Han Jin was very surprised. "Sir, we've already prepared it," the female slave said respectfully. Small characters also had small brains and schemes. When working in the Reaper mercenary team's base, they had to be 120% alert because everyone here was the core of the team. Although they didn't have to work hard to please anyone, they had to at least make them satisfied. The female slaves already understood Han Jin's preferences. At noon, they had already made noodle soup. Every once in a while, before the noodle soup became cold, they would make a new bowl. No matter when Hanjin woke up, they would be able to send the food up as soon as possible. The female slave had been waiting for Hanjin in the dining hall for the entire afternoon. Thank you. Hanjin smiled and nodded. Little Gold Bolt was unhappy. It used its sharp beak to bite on a Hanjin's clothes and pulled with all its might. Hanjin could only bend down, grab Gold Bolt's wings, and carry it to the table. Be good, understand? Hanjin said as he stroked Gold Bolt's neck. Gold Bolt squinted its eyes and obediently laid there. Raphael, didn't you say you had something to do last night? Morrison's finally spoke. His face was full of smiles. It was very successful, right? You? Oh no. Hanjin was surprised. Yes. Morrison's nodded as he exchanged glances with Gibran and the others. If you know, then you know. I wanted to give you all a surprise. Hanjin smiled. He didn't want to hide the existence of the giant ship from these people. Plus, because he treated these people as his brothers and friends, he wanted to give them a surprise. A surprise? Morrison's opened his mouth and laughed. Then, he shouted in a strange voice, "Oh!" Seeing Hanjin admit it, the atmosphere became excited. Saxon, who was very lively, put his arm around Morrison's shoulders and shouted together. Even Gibran laughed and slapped the table. In the end, Winston and Kane also joined in the crazy crowd. Hanjin almost spat out the wheat soup in his mouth. He finally realized that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Little Gold Bolt was also shocked. It looked around, but it couldn't figure out what it was. What are you all shouting for? The door opened, and Julia walked in. Sunir was right behind her. When they saw Sunir, everyone's eyes lit up. Their voices suddenly rose by an octave. What happened before was just the prelude. Now, they were truly crazy. The roars were so loud that it almost tore the roof off. Saxon's roars were the loudest and wildest. Later, Winston stood up and stretched out his arms, hugging Morrison's and Saxon's shoulders and shouting together. The pain of losing a companion. It was time to forget. Life was like this. It was full of life and death. It was sad to lose Paul and the others, but wasn't it good to have the friendship of Hanjin and the others? Sunir had already learned what kind of misunderstanding had happened from Julia. It was already difficult for her to muster up the courage to come here. Seeing that everyone had lost control of themselves, she immediately turned around and ran away with a blush on her face. It's not what you think. Julia was angry and amused at the same time. However, her voice was too soft and was completely drowned out by the roars. Julia angrily stomped her feet and turned to chase after Sunir. Quiet. All of you, quiet down. Hanjin had no choice but to step in to maintain order. He slammed the table a few times, and only then did everyone's roars die down. Stop it. Stop it. It'll be too much if you continue. Gibran shouted with a smile. The roars stopped, and everyone returned to their seats as if nothing had happened. What's going on? Hanjin asked with a frown. No one answered. Everyone was exchanging ambiguous looks. They had just admitted it, and now they were asking what was going on? Hypocrites, hypocrites. Seeing that no one spoke, Hanjin turned his attention to the wheat soup. He wanted to finish it quickly and ask Sunir what was going on. Raphael, have you ever thought about going somewhere else? Gibran asked with a hopeful tone. Among everyone, he and Julia wanted to see Hanjin and Sunir get together the most. This was because he, Julia, Hanjin, and Sunir were facing the same problem. If Hanjin succeeded, he would naturally get a free ride. Even if there were obstacles, Hanjin would help him resolve it. Of course, Julia's determination was unshakable. Even if she couldn't get the forgiveness of the Wild Willow City's elders, she would still get together with Gibran. However, Wild Willow City was her home after all. Seeing the possibility of reconciliation, there was no need for her to betray her home. Gibran had put a lot of thought into this. At the same time, he admired Hanjin's decisiveness and straightforwardness. When he and Julia were together, they could hug, and kiss. However, he didn't dare to take the next step. Go somewhere else? Hanjin slowly shook his head. I don't have time. Oh, Gibran was a little disappointed. He thought that after Han Jin had Sunir, he would definitely make a trip to Wild Willow City to pave the way for the upcoming wedding, which was also to pave the way for him and Julia, who knew that Han Jin didn't have that intention at all. What? Do you want to go somewhere else? Han Jin asked. No, I'm fine here. Gibran smiled. I say, why are all of you so weird today? Can't you be more serious? Winston and Morrison's had sneaky smiles on their faces, which made Han Jin feel a little uncomfortable. He finally made things difficult for them. Winston coughed dryly and tensed up his face. The smile on his face disappeared, but his eyes were full of smiles. This made him look even more sneaky. At this moment, Han Jin didn't have any personal prestige to speak of. He had already done something so indecent. So why couldn't they talk about something indecent? Let's talk about how to get rid of Nicholas, Morrison said with a serious expression. Han Jin really wanted to smash the big bowl in his hand into Morrison's face, but he gave up on this ungentlemanly idea. He only pointed with his finger, and the little gold lightning suddenly opened its sharp beak. A ball of lightning shot out towards Morrison's. Morrison's was caught off guard. He only had time to release his Do Chi to protect himself, but the ball of lightning had already hit his body. Although his upper body was still very stable, the chair couldn't withstand the pressure. The two legs at the back broke at the same time, and Morrison's couldn't help but fall backwards. Damn, Raphael, you're serious. Chapter 272. Han Jin took out a fire element magic crystal from his space ring and slowly put it into his mouth. There were only 3 people here. Hogan was busy in the cabin, and only Harley was floating around on the deck. Facing the ghost that he could kill at will, there was no need for him to hide anything. Han Jin could now absorb the energy of a 6th grade magic crystal. This was a huge breakthrough. His cultivation method could be clearly expressed in numbers. From 1 to 2, it would often take a long time because the energy needed to double. From 2 to 3, it would be easier, but from 8 to 9, it would only take a dozen days. After absorbing the energy of the dragon, his vital energy had reached more than 30 Xian. Since coming back from the Terrasha Mountains, his total vital energy had reached nearly 50 Xian. If magic crystals were used as a standard, he could now absorb the energy of 2 or 3 6th-grade magic crystals every day, plus a few 5th-grade magic crystals. Fortunately, Han Jin already had an equal status in this world. Otherwise, no one could afford to feed him. If the magic crystals that Han Jin consumed every day were converted into gold coins, it would be enough to meet the daily expenses of Lang Ning's Riptide army of thousands. Fortunately, Han Jin had robbed the caravan of the Holy Crown City a long time ago and obtained nearly 400 6th-grade magic crystals, which were now put to good use. Otherwise, Sunir would have a headache. He had never been rejected when he went to the Chamber of Commerce to ask for help. Did he have to go to the Chamber of Commerce and beg for alms? Han Jin had once proposed to use the dragon crystal to pay off the debt, but it was firmly opposed by everyone, especially Yelena, who showed her other side of toughness. As the saying goes, when you have too many lice, you don't itch. When you have too many debts, you don't have to worry. They would wait until the people of the Chamber of Commerce came to ask for the dragon crystal. In fact, Han Jin was also reluctant. Although the dragon crystal had hurt him, he was really reluctant. The hurt here referred to the destruction of his hope. When he had just emerged, he had thought about the future. With the improvement of his realm, his demand for energy naturally increased. Ordinary magic crystals could not meet his needs, so the dragon crystal became his final goal. But he did not expect the dragon crystal to be so big, even bigger than a wash basin. Even if he had a big belly, but did he have a big mouth? Han Jin tried to find a breakthrough in various innate formations, but gave up in the end. The most suitable formation was the Spirit Gathering formation, which could absorb spiritual chi from heaven and earth and form a unique spiritual vein. It should be able to absorb the energy of the dragon crystal, but the problem was that he did not have the materials. He could be careless, but the formation I of the Spirit Gathering formation must be an immortal weapon with a specific function. For example, The spirit-gathering formation of the Kunlun sect used the Western King Cauldron. Where could he steal the Western King Cauldron? Han Jin could only give up on the idea. Anyway, he was not in a hurry. There were many 8th and 9th level magical beasts, and hunting them was easier than hunting giant dragons. When his realm increased, he could go to the Lost Paradise in the center of the Terashah Mountains. Didn't they say that there were countless magical beasts there? If quality was not good, then he would think of a way with quantity. After a moment, Han Jin slowly opened his eyes. The energy of the magic crystals had been completely absorbed. At this moment, Halei floated over. Master, are you not going to start? What's the rush? Wait a little longer. Han Jin said softly. When yin and yang alternated, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth was the most active. Casting spells at this time could often achieve twice the result with half the effort. Compared to what Han Jin wanted to do, 50 Xian was pitifully little. He had to think of a way to get it. Master! Master! Hogan ran up from below, panting. I found the room you need. Which level? The 2nd level. Which area? Because there were too many rooms below, they could only be divided by areas. The 6th area. Take me there in a moment. Han Jin paused. Hogan, how are you going to divide the rooms? Have you thought about it? Not yet, Hogan said with a bitter face. Master, there's only me here. I'm too busy. You'll have to work a little harder. Han Jin looked up at the night sky and slowly stood up. Seeing that Han Jin was about to release magic, Hogan and Halei carefully stood behind Han Jin, so as not to disturb Han Jin. A low shout broke the silence between heaven and earth. Han Jin's hands moved like butterflies. Even with Hogan's eyesight, he couldn't see Han Jin's hands clearly. He could only see a blurry shadow. One talisman after another flew out, turning into streams of light that sprinkled onto the deck of the ship. Like mercury flowing down the floor, they rolled around the deck of the ship. When he was fighting with Caroline and Betty, Han Jin's movement speed was already close to the limit. Now it was even faster. In the blink of an eye, he had already sent out thousands of talismans, and the flowing light had already covered the entire deck of the ship. He had to thank his master. Under his master's painstaking training, Han Jin had become an omniscient cultivator. The only thing he lacked was energy. If he had enough energy, he would truly be omnipotent. At this moment, Hogan suddenly turned his head to look in the direction of isolated Cliff City. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't dare to disturb Han Jin. The flow of heaven and earth, endless growth, open. Han Jin roared. In Hogan and Halei's ears, Han Jin was chanting an incantation that they couldn't understand at all. However, they could see that the streams of light on the ship suddenly revolved around Han Jin and gradually divided into 2 streams. One stream of light grew brighter and brighter, almost blinding them to the point where they couldn't open their eyes. The other stream of light grew dimmer and dimmer, gradually disappearing into the night. Seal! Han Jin roared again. His body sank down, and he sat back down on the chair. The rapidly revolving streams of light suddenly rushed towards Han Jin. Both Hogan and Halei felt dizzy at the same time. They had an illusion that not only those strange lights, but even the sky above them seemed to be sucked in by Han Jin. At this moment, they suddenly saw that the deck of the ship had become infinitely large. Compared to the deck of the ship, they were simply tiny ants. They were dumbfounded as they stared at the terrifyingly vast world. Han Jin sat quietly for a moment and let out a long breath. The feeling of weakness came again. However, this time, he held back some of his strength, so it wasn't as bad as the day before. After all, he had to use all his strength to control the lightning tribulation. Master, Hogan whispered tentatively. Master, Morrisons and Kane are here. They also brought a few knight with them. They seem to be in a hurry and are about to force their way in, Hogan hurriedly said. When Hogan was reporting to Han Jin, Morrisons was angrily waving his longsword. However, he couldn't really do it. He knew that the gargoyles blocking the way were on his side, but the gargoyles didn't recognize anyone. As long as Morrisons came close, they would bare their fangs and brandish their claws to force Morrisons to retreat. Damn it. What the hell is that old man Hogan doing? After being forced to retreat again, Morrison's couldn't help but curse. Who's going to take responsibility if something goes wrong? Maybe Raphael is doing something and can't be disturbed, Kane said softly. As a magician, he knew very well the relationship between the gargoyles and Hogan. Hogan already knew that they were coming, but he was determined not to let them in. There must be a reason. I'm really angry. Morrison's didn't care what the reason was. He glared at Kane and roared. Did you hear that? I'm really going to lose my temper. What's going on? With a flash of a shadow, Han Jin suddenly appeared in front of them. Raphael, did you teleport? Kane's eyes widened. Sort of. Han Jin changed the topic. What's so urgent? Kane came back to his senses and turned around. Raphael, they're Lang Ning's men. They have an urgent military report for you. Master, a knight stepped forward and bowed respectfully. The general wrote you an urgent letter. We didn't dare to delay, so we could only— Where's the letter? Han Jin interrupted the knight. The knight held out a letter with both hands. Han Jin took the letter, tore open the seal, and read it under the moonlight. Lang Ning described in detail what had happened in the past few days. The Beatman's allied army had been completely wiped out. Lang Ning had made ample preparations beforehand, so his counterattack had been unstoppable. He had captured 3 of the Beatman cities, but he had run into trouble when he attacked the last city, Fort Maxine. The area around Fort Maxine was shrouded in a thick black fog. It was so dark that it was impossible to advance. Ronning had sent soldiers to scout the area, but none of them returned alive. Ronning had already lost hundreds of warriors because of the scouting. In the end, Guevara had no choice but to take action himself. However, in the black fog, Guevara was besieged by hundreds of abyssal mages. Fortunately, he was strong enough to fight his way out. Lang Ning relayed Guevara's opinion. The situation was not good. Fort Maxine should have reached some kind of compromise or cooperation with Zagund. This meant 2 things. First, Zagund had changed his target and given up on his hatred for Dismark. Second, Zagund should have taken control of the underground city, or at least entered the final stage. That was why he had the energy to interfere with what was happening on the surface. Because of the irreconcilable conflict between the races, Black Raven City was in a state of disrepair. Almost all the natives had been killed. They had just conquered the Bite Man and had no time to digest the fruits of their victory. It was very dangerous for them to confront Zagund at this time. According to Guevara's opinion, after they had gained a firm foothold, they should attack Dismark first. Because Dismark's strength was relatively weak, of course they should pick the weakest one. This also showed Guevara's magnanimity. He was thinking about the big picture, not personal hatred. Otherwise, he would have encouraged Han Jin to choose Zagund. In the end, Lang Ning said in the letter that he had decided to temporarily withdraw his troops and asked for Han Jin's opinion. The knight quietly looked at Han Jin. Perhaps Han Jin did not realize it, but they knew very well that this was the first time that Lang Ning had asked for Han Jin's permission for a military operation. This was of great significance to the entire Riptide. To put it bluntly, from this moment on, the Legion would have to change its leader. I agreed to withdraw my troops. Han Jin made the decision without hesitation. Go back and tell him to wait for me for 1.5 months. Wait for you for 1.5 months? The knight looked at each other. Chapter 273. These knights were Lang Ning's messengers. Although they didn't understand the meaning of Han Jin's words, they didn't dare to ask further as they knew that they weren't qualified to do so. Some things always spread quickly. For example, Han Jin had obtained a dragon crystal that was bigger than a wash basin. He had casually gone to the Kingdom of Magnificent Light in the southwest region and returned with a dragon crystal without any injuries. This made people feel that it was unimaginable. Moreover, Han Jin had never talked about his experience in the Kingdom of Magnificent Light, which made it even more mysterious. It wasn't just the people of isolated Cliff City who were talking about Han Jin. Lang Ning's Riptide was also the same. What the soldiers liked to do the most was to secretly speculate or fantasize about the real strength of the big boss behind the scenes. The influence left by the former Legion commander, Knight of Conrad, had become almost negligible. Reality was cruel, and people always had to find ways to survive. It wasn't hard to choose whether to continue hiding in the empty shadow of the Knight of Conrad or to be loyal to a Buddha in the present world. Han Jin asked the knights to rest for the night before leaving, but they couldn't wait any longer. They were still worried about the situation at the front line, so they didn't even eat before they set off in the night. During the process of receiving the messengers, Han Jin's expression remained calm, but his heart was in turmoil because he knew Guevara very well. Guevara was an arrogant and ambitious dragon knight. Although Guevara's edges had been smoothed over with the passage of time, some traces could still be seen. If Guevara said that the situation was not optimistic, then it must be very dangerous. Under such great pressure, Han Jin could only force himself to challenge his limits. Days flew by, and for nearly a month, Han Jin didn't return to isolated Cliff City. Every night, he would release his magic at midnight. When his vital energy was exhausted, he would find a place to rest on the ship. After he woke up, he would eat something and immediately begin to adjust his breathing. Until late at night, his spirit became vigorous again, but his vital energy had only recovered half. He would then absorb the energy from the magic crystals, train the little thunderbirds, and continue to release his magic at midnight to use up all his recovered vital energy. Day and night passed, and this was the first time Han Jin had used all his energy in time to do something. That night, Han Jin stepped out of his room and closed the door behind him. With a flash of light, the door disappeared without a trace. From the outside, it was just an ordinary wall. "Sir, they have arrived," Hogan shouted from the end of the corridor. "Let's go and welcome them." Han Jin smiled. "Master, what about me?" Harley pointed at his nose. "You come with me too." "But there's an archbishop outside." "It doesn't matter. He'll find out sooner or later," Han Jin said lightly. In fact, Yelena and the others were very curious about Han Jin's mysteriousness. They had heard that Han Jin seemed to be building a giant ship, but they knew that it was definitely not that simple. After receiving Han Jin's invitation, they knew that it was time to uncover the mystery. Everyone was here, and no one wanted to miss it. Along the long steps, everyone stepped onto the giant ship one after another. Although many of them were experienced and knowledgeable, it was their first time seeing such a huge ship, and they couldn't help but be amazed. "Raphael, what are you doing here?" Yelena was the first to ask. She had the same question as Hogan. Hogan secretly sneered. He knew that now was not the time for him to be in the limelight. Otherwise, he would have jumped out to answer. "Raphael won't do anything stupid. I guess this ship should be able to sail on land, right?" Jedis said with a smile. He had already seen Harley, but unexpectedly, Jedis didn't show any reaction. "I agree," Kane said with a smile. "Look, there are more than 10 magic crystal cannons over there. If this ship couldn't move, Raphael wouldn't have installed magic crystal cannons on it." Everyone's eyes were focused on Han Jin, waiting for Han Jin to give them an answer. Unfortunately, no one had guessed correctly. It wasn't that they weren't smart enough, but that the real answer was too absurd. At least in this world, it was absurd. The vice president of the Mercenary Association, Juventus, was also invited. He and Dwight Steele looked at each other and shook their heads slightly. Although they had a smile on their faces, they didn't think much of it. There was no such thing as a free lunch. The Chamber of Commerce Alliance and the Mercenary Association supported Han Jin because they believed that Han Jin was a peerless powerhouse who could create a storm and completely control it. Moreover, Han Jin was very young, and his wings were growing. He had enough time to grow and mature. At the same time, they were silently waiting for Han Jin to truly explode. Slaying a dragon was nothing. If Han Jin could completely defeat any of the famous lords nearby, that would be the best proof. The Chamber of Commerce Alliance and the Mercenary Association both knew that Zagund had already interfered with the Beatman situation. They were looking forward to Han Jin's fierce counterattack. Who would have thought that Hanjin would hide and build a giant ship? This made some people very disappointed. There were even voices of opposition within the Chamber of Commerce Alliance and the Mercenary Association. Even if a giant ship could really travel on land, what did it mean? Could they cross mountains and steep ridges? Could it cross rivers? It was said that the ship was already more than 40 meters wide. How could there be such a wide road on the continent? Hanjin was too whimsical. Dwight Steele acted as if he couldn't tell what Juventus was thinking. He still maintained his warm smile. The King's super mercenary group was in the midst of construction, and Hanjin was the group's leader. No matter what he thought, he couldn't embarrass Hanjin in front of everyone. At most, he could talk to Hanjin behind his back. Dwight Steele wasn't the only one who thought this way. Everyone else thought the same. They all thought that the giant ship would be very strange, but after seeing it with their own eyes, they were all disappointed. After spending so much time and effort, this was all they got? But no one wanted to ruin the atmosphere. Even Jed smiled and didn't say anything. Just because he never lied didn't mean that he had to say something that would make everyone feel disgusted. He could just keep silent. It was still the same old saying. The real answer was too absurd. Some people had thought of it, but such a huge thing flying in the sky. It was impossible. Since ancient times, when had anyone ever created such a magical item? Even they thought that their idea was ridiculous. However, there were a few people who were happy and honest. Sunir, Morrison's, Yelena, and the others were among them. There was a cause, and there was an effect. Their acquaintance and friendship had nothing to do with material gains. Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought along the useless Hanjin and Stillberg. Otherwise, after Yelena escaped from danger, she could have kept her arrogant attitude towards Hanjin and the others, compensated them appropriately, and then left. What was the point of hanging out with these mercenaries? But in reality, Sunir and Morrison's never looked down on Hanjin. They even treated Stillberg as a partner, and Yelena, as a proud daughter of heaven, didn't leave either. It was all because of love, just because of love. They didn't care what the ship could do. As long as Hanjin did it, they would cheer for Hanjin. That was what friends were for. What was the use? This was nonsense. What was the use of Raphael, a fallen noble? Hanjin flipped his hand and shot a talisman. The talisman shot into the sky with an ear-piercing screech, and a vague shadow quickly approached the ship. It was the Thunderbirds led by Little Gold Lightning. Under the nourishment of the spiritual beast sacrifice material, the Thunderbirds grew very quickly. According to common sense, they would only learn to fly after 3 months, but now they had all become aerial athletes. Soon, the Thunderbirds landed on both sides of the ship and curiously looked at the people. "Stand firm." Hanjin smiled and sat on a chair. Suddenly, the ship trembled slightly and then slowly began to move. Haha, it really moved. Lord Raphael, you are a genius. Juventus laughed heartily, but his smile quickly stiffened. He then violently shoved Dwight Steele aside and rushed to the side of the ship, turning into a statue. The faces of Jedis, Dwight Steele, and the others also changed. They all rushed to the sides because they felt the ship rising. Then Sunir, Morrison's, Sisu, and the others also rushed to the side of the ship. Their feeling was right. The ship was slowly rising into the sky. The forest below became smaller and smaller, and the lights of isolated Cliff City could already be seen. Everyone was dumbfounded. Hanjin sat motionless. His spiritual sense had already merged with the ship. In fact, this ship was an incomplete magical treasure. Compared to ordinary magical treasures, it was just that its size was too large, so Hanjin put in a lot more effort. In isolated Cliff City, some people happened to see a scene they would never forget for the rest of their lives. A huge object that looked like a broadsword pierced straight into the sky, cutting the moon in half. The people on the deck were stunned for a long time. Yelena was the first to let out a high-pitched scream. Her little face was flushed with excitement, and she slapped the side of the ship hard as if she couldn't feel any pain. The little Thunderbirds on both sides were frightened and kept a distance away, watching Yelena vigilantly. This was a subversion of common sense, a miraculous subversion. Jedis, Juventus, Dwight Steele, and the others were also shocked and excited, but with their age and experience, they were not used to using their voices or body language to express their emotions. God, God! Yelena was still screaming. Raphael, how did you do it? Damn, I'm now a Dragon Knight, right? Don't you think so? Don't you think so? Morrison's opened his mouth and howled. Compared to magicians, warriors like Morrison's were far more excited. This was the first time in their lives that they could control the sky. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Juventus held the side of the ship tightly, his body trembling with excitement. He was also a warrior. As for his previous disapproval, he had long since tossed it to God knows where. Jedis was in a trance. His experience on the battlefield was far better than Hogan's. He immediately thought of what Hogan thought of, and he also thought of what Hogan couldn't think of. My lords, Hogan chuckled. This is just the beginning. Chapter 274. The two completely different concepts of size and agility were perfectly combined on Han Jin's giant ship. As Han Jin gradually familiarized himself with it, the ship flew faster and faster, to the point where everyone had the illusion that the ship wasn't moving at all. What was moving was the sky and the land. Seeing the mountains pouncing towards them and then flashing past the bottom of the ship at lightning speed, this kind of frightening scene could no longer be described with words. Most of the people who were invited were the best in their professions. For them, properly controlling their emotions was just a basic skill, even a habit. They quickly recovered, but Han Jin's image in their hearts had become unusually tall and mysterious. In the past, Han Jin was just a strong man with unfathomable strength, but from today onwards, he had become a true grandmaster. The ship under their feet was the most powerful proof. No matter whether Han Jin won or lost in the future, it was enough for him to go down in history. Suddenly, the angle of the ship's flight changed, and it shot down diagonally. Raphael, what's wrong? Yelena exclaimed. Are we out of control? No. Jed shook his head. Haven't you noticed that our postures are very strange? Postures? Yelena was stunned. Yes, we're flying downwards. Juventus once again revealed a shocked expression. The inside of the ship was a world of its own, unaffected by the outside world. Just now, the ship was flying so fast, but the people on the ship couldn't feel the wind at all. Now, the ship was sprinting toward the ground, and the entire hull was tilted, but they were still able to stand there steadily without any signs of imbalance. F*CK. Raphael, we're going to hit it. We're going to hit it. Morrison's University shouted. Han Jin remained indifferent. He still sat there quietly with his eyes slightly closed and a faint smile hanging on the corner of his mouth. Somehow, when he saw Han Jin's expression, Moxink suddenly became quiet. He turned around and silently stared at the forest that was getting closer and closer to him. A burst of shattering sounds were heard, and the ship finally rushed into the forest. The direction of flight changed in an instant, and the bow of the ship was raised, almost sticking to the ground as it moved forward. Rows of thick and small trees were all crushed to pieces, and the seemingly ordinary ship suddenly glowed, and the broken branches and leaves that filled the sky were all blocked by an invisible layer. A chasm that was more than 50 meters wide appeared in the sea of trees. Behind the giant ship, sand and stones flew everywhere, and patches of grass were uprooted, rising like smoke and dust, forming a comet tail that was several hundred meters long. They didn't know the true face of Mount Lu, only because they were in it. The people on the ship only knew that it was flying very fast, but they couldn't tell how fast it was. In fact, the ship always maintained a certain distance from the ground. They couldn't feel the flow of air on the ship, but that didn't mean there wasn't any outside. With such a huge object flying at extreme speed, the airflow it created was unimaginably strong, and the pieces of grass were all uprooted by the airflow. No, there's a rock in front. There's a big rock. Sir Raphael, Juventus shouted. Juventus had good eyesight, and with the help of the moonlight, he saw a huge rock that was more than 10 meters tall a few hundred meters in front of them. Unfortunately, with the speed of the ship, a few hundred meters was too close. Before Juventus could finish his words, the ship had already crashed heavily into the rock. With a loud bang, the ship shook slightly, but continued to fly forward. The huge rock was smashed into pieces, and large and small stones rained down on the deck of the ship. The people on the ship reacted very quickly. Yelena, Cain, and a few other mages immediately released magic shields, while Winston, Dwight Steele, and the others reflexively pulled out their weapons. There was no need for them to make a move. Everyone could clearly see that the rocks were suddenly bounced into the air like exploding fireworks. The bow of the ship tilted slightly, and the ship once again shot diagonally into the sky. Just as everyone was relieved, they found that the ship was gradually tilting to the left. If it was just a normal tilt, they could still bear it, but the angle of the ship's tilt was frighteningly large, and in the end, it was completely vertical. At this moment, almost everyone grabbed the side of the ship, and even the little Thunderbirds on the ship felt uneasy. Hogan, who had been mentally prepared, showed a shocked expression for the first time. Just like he said at the beginning, this was just the beginning. At least, Hanjin hadn't had his fill yet. The ship continued to tilt, and in the end, the bottom of the ship was facing the sky, while the deck was facing the ground. It was completely upside down. Raphael, we're not going to fall, are we? Morrison's, who had already calmed down, became restless again. At this moment, it was impossible for him not to be restless. Oh my God! Yelena grabbed the side of the ship with one hand and pressed down on her dress with the other. Because she was here to cheer for Hanjin, she was dressed in a splendid white dress, which made her look radiant. However, if the dress was turned upside down, it would be like spring sunshine. The others were only worried that they would fall, but compared to them, Yelena was more worried about her dress. Except for Hanjin and Harley, no one could remain calm. Sunir tightly clasped the back of Hanjin's chair with both hands. Hogan's legs were trembling slightly, and even Jedis had temporarily lost his ability to think. Like the others, he was holding on to the side of the ship, not daring to let go. The feeling of spatial disorder caused by the reversal of heaven and earth was really unimaginable. It was as if an invisible hand had grabbed their hearts, causing them to feel so nervous that they couldn't even beat. Thinking was something that would happen after they had calmed down. Right now, they only wanted to instinctively protect themselves. As the giant ship flew forward, it slowly rotated. After another 180-degree turn, the sense of space finally returned to normal. Hanjin slowly stood up and gently grabbed Sunir's small hand. He smiled and said, "Are you scared?" Sunir nodded at first, but when she saw Hanjin's smiling eyes, she shook her head. "Raphael, let's stop playing." Morrison's cried in an almost pleading tone. In fact, everyone more or less had acrophobia. It was just that some people's symptoms were very severe, while others could control their inner fear. This was different from fighting an enemy. Just now, Morrison's was really scared. "This isn't playing. He's testing the performance of this ship," Jeds said softly. "Yelena, you, Cain, and Hogan will have to work harder during this period of time," Hanjin said with a smile. "What do you need me to do?" Yelena asked as she quietly pulled at the hem of her skirt with both hands, trying to even out the creases that she had just scratched. "Just do whatever you see here that's missing. And me." Jed stroked the side of the ship with his hand and smiled. "Now, I'm very interested in your magic props. You don't mind if I study and observe here, right?" Yelena and Sasu looked at each other and saw the smile in each other's eyes. Could Hanjin's magic be learned just by looking and thinking? They had stayed by Hanjin's side for so long, but they still had no clue. Jed's ending was destined to be full of disappointment. "Not only you, I don't think any magician would want to miss this opportunity," Cain said. "I can't wait to welcome it," Hanjin said with a smile. "Raphael, I feel that your magic ship is already perfect. Do you need anything else?" Yelena asked. "There's nothing perfect in this world." Hanjin shook his head. "Besides, I still have a lot of things that I haven't done yet." In other words, you'll do it with us? Yelena's gaze became fervent. Yes. Okay, I'm fine with it, Yelena said. Kane, what about you? I'm fine with it too. Yelena's gaze fell on Jed's. Jed's shrugged his shoulders. Don't ask me. Even if someone drives me away, I won't leave. While they were talking, the ship had already flown back to its original berth and slowly landed. Raphael, you don't need to sit there to control your magic ship. Yelena pointed at the lonely armchair. Indeed, Hanjin had placed all the eyes of the array under the chair. Although Yelena and the others couldn't sense the fluctuation of magic power, they knew that this was the center of the giant ship for no reason when they entered this self-contained world. If it's just simple flight, I can control it anywhere. Amazing. It's amazing. Juventus sighed. His heart had grown wings, and he really wanted to fly back to the Mercenary Association and tell the objectors everything he had seen with his own eyes. Then, he would tell them what a stupid mistake they had made. As for his initial disapproval, he had long forgotten about it. People were always like this. They liked to nitpick about other people's mistakes, but they chose to forget about themselves out of habit. It turned out that the steps were built by the carpenters. After the ship took off, all the steps fell off. Hogan hurriedly took out a rope ladder and hung it on the side of the ship. Although everyone here was a professional, they couldn't force people to jump from a height of more than 20 meters. Strong warriors like Winston and Saxon had no problem, but people like Gibran and Leger would have a hard time. Stepping on the ground, Moxing felt extremely stable and safe. He couldn't help but let out a long sigh. He had never realized that the earth was so warm and friendly. Sir, if there's nothing else, I'll go back first. Juventus bowed slightly. Many people in our guild know that you've been making magic tools here. It's time to give them a surprise. All right. Hanji nodded. Dwight Steele was lost in thought as he stared at Juventus back. He originally wanted to tell Han Jean what Juventus had said, but on second thought, it would be a lose-lose move. Not only would it belittle Juventus, but it would also put a question mark on his character. Dwight Steele had always had a close relationship with Juventus, so it was better to play dumb when it was time. Chapter 275. It was now the end of summer and the beginning of autumn. The gentle breeze gave people a refreshing feeling, but Lang Ning's heart was filled with irritation. It had been more than a month since his attack at Fort Maxine was thwarted. He had been waiting for Han Jin's news, but he did not even receive a messenger. Guevara, Lang Ning, and Alexander sat facing each other in silence. Guevara was a famous general in Kamai, and although Lang Ning was a rising star, he was half a son of the former commander of Riptide, the Knight of Conrad. Because Leger did not like military matters since he was young, the Knight of Conrad could only focus his efforts on Lang Ning, even treating him as a successor. Now that he had received some pointers from Guevara, his military accomplishments had improved tremendously. They were all well-versed in military strategy, and they knew what the current stalemate meant. Zagund had only sent out abyssal mages to help defend Fort Maxine and did not launch an attack. This meant that Zagund was tied up with something that he had to deal with. As the saying goes, attack is the best defense. What they should do now was to immediately take down Fort Maxine and attack Zagund's underground city. If they waited until Zagund was free, it would be too late. However, even a clever wife could not cook a meal without rice. Riptide only had so many soldiers, and they were also lacking in resources. They did not have an organized mage group, and naturally, they did not have enough resources to fight against hundreds of abyssal mages. Moreover, the abyssal mages were hiding in the thick fog, and Lang Ning could not find a way to take advantage of this situation. Attack at all costs? That was even more undesirable. Influenced by Guevara, Lang Ning's vision was no longer limited to one city or one place. His future opponents included Dismark, Depew City, Cold Shadow City, and perhaps Wild Willow City. If they really used up all their troops, the other lords who were eyeing them covetously would definitely not mind sharing the fruits of their labor. Lang Ning's mood was somewhat pessimistic. He originally wanted to send a few more messengers back to ask for help, but was stopped by Guevara. Guevara said that they had already laid out the prospects, opportunities, and dangers of the entire situation clearly. Raphael should know what he should do. If he was forced to act only because he had no other choice, Raphael would lose to others sooner or later, and it would be no different from losing to Zagun now. Langning also wanted to ask for help from the Chamber of Commerce Alliance and the Mercenary Association in isolated Cliff City, but was again stopped by Guevara. The Chamber of Commerce Alliance had already helped so much, and they had already done their best. Moreover, they really wanted to see the duel between Raphael and Zagund, so that they could verify whether their judgment was right or wrong. Furthermore, they did not need to put all their eggs in one basket. It would be fine if they won, but what if Raphael lost to Zagund? Who would be able to withstand Zagund's anger? There was nothing they could do but wait, and wait in silence. It was not a good feeling. Just as Lang Ning was sighing, there was suddenly a commotion outside. The noise was getting louder and louder, and it almost engulfed the entire camp. Lang Ning could not help but frown. The soldiers of Riptide were not random soldiers. Every one of them had undergone strict training. A general hurriedly lifted the curtain and rushed in. "General, quick, quick, go out and take a look. You." Before he could finish his words, under Ronning's sharp gaze, the general hurriedly shut his mouth and retreated outside, shouting, "General, I have an urgent military situation. Don't scare them." Guevara smiled and stood up. "Let's go out and take a look." Guevara walked in front. Lang Ning and Alexander also left their seats and walked out of the tent. Although they were mentally prepared, they were still stunned by the incredible scene in front of them. A huge ship was hovering above the camp. Lang Ning and hundreds of soldiers were all standing in the shadow of the huge ship. The camp was a little chaotic. The knight took out his longbow and pointed it at the huge ship. They did not know if their arrows would be effective, but it was the only thing they could do. If the ship was malicious, they had to do something. Dozens of magicians were frantically ordering the soldiers to adjust the magic crystal cannons. The magic crystal cannons gave them a sense of security, but it was very limited. The ship was alive and could change its position at any time. However, the cannons could not follow the target's movements. If there was a conflict, they would be in a passive position. "What is that?" Lang Ning said blankly. No one could give him an answer. Even Guevara was in a daze. A ship could fly in the air? Not to mention seeing it with his own eyes. He had never even heard of it. The huge ship slowly circled around. Perhaps it could not find enough space in the camp, so it turned and flew out of the camp. Then, it slowly landed on the ground about 100 meters away from the camp. Guevara and the others were relieved. The fact that the ship could land meant that at least the people who came were not malicious. They hurriedly walked out of the camp. Of course, they had to see what was going on. Behind Ronning and the others, the soldiers of the Riptide Regiment also surged out. The slave warriors under Alexander's direct command, however, maintained strict discipline. They stood quietly in a square formation and wouldn't move unless Alexander gave the order. A long rope ladder was thrown down from the ship's side. Then, a figure climbed down from the rope ladder. When it was about 7 or 8 meters from the ground, it somersaulted in the air and landed steadily on the ground. "Young Marshal! It's the young Marshal!" A few sharp-eyed soldiers cried out. Then, they timidly looked in the direction of Lang Ning and did not dare to shout anymore. "Leger! How?" Lang Ning could not believe his eyes. After a while, he reacted. "Where's Sir Raphael?" "Raphael is waiting for you on the ship." "Come, follow me," Leger said softly. This ship is..." Lang Ning was close to incoherent speech. "Of course it's Raphael's masterpiece." Leger smiled. His gaze swept over the soldiers and quickly returned to Lang Ning. "How is it? Very surprised, right?" Actually, when we first saw this ship, we were not much better than you. Come, let's go." Lang Ning patted hard on the shoulder. Only then did Lang Ning wake up. He turned to the generals behind him and said in a deep voice, "All of you, follow me." After more than a month of preparation, Hanjin's ship had a lot more things. More than 40 selected female slaves were in charge of cleaning, organizing, and other chores. It cannot be helped. With more people, more trash would be created. The most troublesome ones were the 100 or so little thunderbirds. If they were not cleaned up in a few days, the ship would become a garbage dump filled with feathers and bird feces. In comparison, the hundreds of gargoyles brought by Hogan were much cuter. Without Hogan's orders, they were like statues that did not eat, drink, or move. In addition to the female slaves, there were more than 100 slave warriors. They were in charge of some manual labor, and each of them carried a longbow. This was not a ship, so there was no possibility of boarding a ship. As long as they had a certain amount of long-range attack ability, they would be fine. The encampment of the Reaper mercenary team in isolated Cliff City was almost empty. Everyone who could come was here. This was a true expedition. On both sides of the ship, there were more than 100 magic crystal cannons. The muzzles had been fixed. Hanjin had created an unprecedented magic tool, which had caused a strong reaction within the Chamber of Commerce Alliance and the Mercenary Association. Everything had become a matter of course. What Hogan wanted was quickly realized. There were more than 180 cabins on the ship, enough for everyone. Of course, the female slaves and slave warriors could not enjoy the same treatment as individual cabins. Yelena had built a relatively simple laboratory that combined magic and alchemy on the ship. It was right next to her bedroom. Yelena also asked Hanjin to open another door for her. From now on, she could run to the laboratory anytime, anywhere, even without combing her hair or washing her face. When she was tired or sleepy, she could open the door and enter her bedroom. Every time she thought of this, Yelena would tremble with happiness. This was her dream, but it could not be realized in the capital of elements. This was because the magic laboratory had a certain degree of danger and had to be built in a remote place. Grand Duke Solomon could not risk the palace being blown up and let Yelena do whatever she wanted. Soon, Leger, Lang Ning, and the generals of Riptide jumped onto the deck of the ship. In the middle of the deck, there was a chair. Hanjin was sitting on it, while the powerhouses surrounded him like stars surrounding the moon. Jedis, Majordomo Gale, Yelena, Dwight Steele, Winston, Gibran, and so on. Any one of these people would be the target of many forces, but here, they were only the green leaves that served as a foil to the red flower. As a matter of fact, Hanjin was just a cultivator, not an ambitious person. The reason why he placed a chair was just to relax his body and mind, so that he could better concentrate on manipulating his magic weapon. When standing, it was inevitable that he would have to divert some of his attention to maintain his balance. As the saying goes, only by sitting can one enter a state of meditation. Hanjin really didn't expect such an effect before. Lang Ning took a deep breath and walked slowly until he was about 10 meters away from Hanjin. Suddenly, he knelt on one knee and said, "My lord, you are finally here." Leger was stunned, Guevara was stunned, and even Hanjin was stunned. Although he and Lang Ning had some tacit understanding, he had always thought of Lang Ning as a friend. He never expected that Lang Ning would kneel. The second one to kneel down was Alexander, but the effect he had caused was far less shocking than the first. Everyone knew that it was Hanjin's initiative that allowed Alexander and the slaves to regain their freedom. Regardless of emotion or reason, Hanjin deserved Alexander's kowtow. Riptide's generals paused for a moment, then knelt down one after another. What had worried Morrison's Sisu and the others disappeared with this kneel. Everything was a foregone conclusion. Guevara was observing Leger's expression. When he saw that Leger was stunned for a moment and quickly returned to normal, he breathed a sigh of relief. At this moment, he suddenly felt that someone was observing him. He quickly turned his head and met Jedi's gaze. Jed's nodded with a smile as a greeting, then turned his gaze elsewhere. "Lang Ning, get up," Hanjin said softly. "Tell us more about Fort Maxine." Chapter 276. The newly crowned vampire queen, Lindsay, was proudly training her vampire army. Ever since Betty and Carolyn died, she had obtained the right to command this army. Of course, she knew in her heart that this was all thanks to that man. To that man, it didn't matter who was in command of this army. What mattered was whether the leader of this army was loyal or not. While Linsell was absent-mindedly thinking about how to further strengthen her current position, her heart suddenly skipped a beat. She involuntarily looked to the west. At the same time, all the vampires seemed to have sensed something. They all looked to the west, but there was nothing in sight. There was only a boundless plain and a blue sky. However, all the vampires present, including Linsell, clearly felt a throbbing from the depths of their hearts. It was as if the most primitive desire had suddenly been awakened. All the vampires began to feel restless. Gradually, the feeling became stronger and stronger. Linsell's heartbeat also became faster and faster. In the end, Linsell could even hear the thumping sound in her body. It was as if it was in accordance with some kind of rhythm. All the vampires' heartbeats were adjusted to the same rhythm by an invisible force. Thump! Thump! The hearts of the vampires were beating as though they were stepping on a strange drum. Apart from the sound of their heartbeats, there was nothing else in the vampires' ears. Thump! Thump! The heartbeats of thousands of vampires converged into a single sound, echoing in the vast expanse of heaven and earth. Every vampire's face revealed an anxious expression, but the strange thing was that no one dared to move. They just stood there quietly, waiting for something. Finally, a dark cloud appeared on the horizon. Following that was a tremendous pressure that filled the entire world. Linsell's mind suddenly went blank. She bent her knees and knelt down. A strange scene appeared. All the vampires prostrated themselves on the ground in a pious posture, as if they were waiting for the guidance of a god. Linsell's heart was filled with fear. She knew what was coming. It was the ancestor. Among the blood-breeds, they were godlike existences. If the Pope was the spiritual leader of humans and the spokesperson of God, then the ancestors of the blood-breeds were gods to the vampires. No vampire could resist the will of their ancestors, not even in their hearts. The spiritual shackles that had been deeply rooted in their bones since ancient times were something that the vampires could never get rid of in their entire lives. Linsell wanted to go back and tell the man what had happened here, but she couldn't move. It was as if the mental shackles were not only imprisoning her mind, but also her body. The dark clouds were getting closer and closer, so close that Linsell could see the huge silver bat flying at the front. Slowly, Linsell put her head on the ground. Her loyalty to her ancestors had been deeply imprinted in her blood. At this moment, that man was no longer important. Alquite flew at the front of the group, his eyes flashing with a demonic red light. His enormous spiritual power allowed him to feel the piety and submission of his descendants. Alquite smiled silently. If it were any other vampire from his generation, they wouldn't be able to achieve this effect. Only he, Alquite, the one with the strongest spiritual power among the blood-breeds, could do this because his talent was unique among the blood-breeds. Mind chain. Zagund had appeared on top of the city wall without anyone noticing. His gaze was gloomy as he looked at the approaching dark clouds. Linsell, Zaganide suddenly shouted in a low voice. His muffled voice sounded like a thunderclap in Linsell's ears. Linsell immediately felt her whole body relax. The shackles that had been shackling her all this time had disappeared in a flash. "Why aren't you going to greet him?" Linsell silently glanced at Zagund, stepped out of the crowd, and stood at the front. Alquite's eyes suddenly glowed red, and even his body lit up with a layer of faintly discernible bloody light. His flying speed suddenly increased as well. At the same time, Linsell only felt as if her heart had been hit by a sledgehammer. Her legs couldn't help but soften, and she knelt down again. "Old man," Zagund snorted. "You have quite the temper. I'll let you win this round for now." Alquite suddenly accelerated, and his entire body turned into a silver stream of light. When he flew above Linsell, he had already turned into a human form. However, without the support of his wings, Alquite's body strangely didn't fall to the ground. Instead, it was as if he was stepping on an invisible staircase, and, just like that, he walked down step by step in the air. The vampires didn't show the slightest bit of surprise at such a thing that defied common sense. They just stuck their bodies closer to the ground, as if this was the only way to better show their respect to their ancestors. Zagun's pupils contracted, and he muttered in a voice that only he could hear, "Has his spiritual power turned into a substance? Haha, but it's a pity. Do you really not know about the powerhouses from the abyss? Excessive showing off often comes from a sense of inferiority." However, there wasn't the slightest trace of inferiority on Alquite's face. Caressing his meticulous silver hair, Alquite said kindly, "Rise, my children." It was just a short sentence, but the vampires felt as if a warm current had flowed from the top of their heads to the bottom of their feet. Their entire body felt extremely comfortable, and this made them even more convinced. They all prostrated themselves on the ground and respectfully kowtowed before standing up. Lincel walked in front of Alquite, bowed deeply, and stood to the side without saying a word. Alquite looked up at Zagun on the city wall and smiled. "Young man, don't tell me you're going to stand there and talk to me forever." Zagund let out a long laugh, jumped down from the city wall, and landed in front of Alquite. He placed his right hand on his chest and bowed slightly. "Zagund is honored to have you here." A strange light flashed across Alquite's eyes, but it quickly returned to normal. This was because he noticed that when Zagund landed on the ground, he didn't make a single sound. "I had no choice but to come." Alquite sighed with a mournful look. "I'll give you an explanation for that," Zagund said softly. "Please take a seat inside. It's not convenient to talk here." At this time, the vampires that followed Alquite had arrived. They all transformed into their human forms and landed on the ground, neatly forming a huge square formation. Alquite nodded and walked into the castle side by side with Zagund, but he didn't even look at the vampires. Zagund asked in a low voice, a little surprised, "Do you want me to find a place to settle the people who came with you?" Alquite waved his hand and said casually, "No need. Let them wait outside." Alquite's voice wasn't loud, but the vampires who were still some distance away heard him clearly. They immediately knelt on the ground and answered loudly, "Yes, ancestor." One person's voice might not be loud enough, but thousands of voices sounded at the same time. It was like a muffled thunder exploding above the castle, and it was exceptionally shocking. Zagund shook his head imperceptibly, and a sarcastic smile appeared on his face. However, Alquite, who was walking beside him, didn't notice this. When they entered the inner hall, Zagund deliberately let Alquite sit at the head of the table, and Alquite sat down without hesitation. Although Zagund was the owner of the castle, Alquite's status was still there. He was the owner of a city and the leader of a huge clan. In comparison, Alquite's status was more respected. "I'm also very sad about what happened to Betty and Caroline," Zagund said straightforwardly. Since the ancestor of the blood breed had appeared at this time, his purpose was self-evident. "But you may not know this, but I didn't agree to their operation because it wasn't within my sphere of influence. More importantly, there were many opponents who were eyeing me covetously. I couldn't leave this place at all. It's not that I don't want to avenge them. It's just that I can't do two things at the same time." Zagund's tone was very sincere. In fact, what he said was indeed the truth. Alquite listened quietly and didn't say a word. Zagund sighed. "You should be able to imagine how big of a blow this has to me. Not only did I lose 2 wives, but my son also died in the hands of that young man. If possible, I really want to go to Isolated Cliff City and tear that damned bastard into pieces." "So, your situation here isn't optimistic either?" Alquite finally spoke. "Time. What I need is time," Zagund said firmly. "What they have, I have, and what I have, they don't. As long as I have enough time, do you think they'll be able to defeat me?" Alquite pondered for a while and suddenly smiled. "Time. For us blood breeds, perhaps the one thing we don't lack the most is time. But," Alquite's fingers lightly tapped on the armrest as he said slowly, "the murderer who killed Betty and Caroline, I won't allow him to live in this world." Zagund spread out his hands awkwardly. "You see, I really can't leave here. Otherwise, I would have gone there myself. Can you give me a little more time?" Alquite sighed and shook his head. "It seems that it's time for my old bones to relax." "You mean?" Zagund leaned forward with a hint of joy in his eyes. If we turn that isolated cliff city into our own city, from a geographical point of view, wouldn't it be more beneficial to your current situation? Alquite's eyes flashed with a hint of sharpness. Your city. Zagund's face became serious. That's right. Alquite elegantly picked up the wine glass beside his hand and took a sip, as if he didn't realize how much of an impact his words had on the lord in front of him. Zagund sat there with a gloomy expression, his heart filled with uncertainty. He originally thought that the ancestors of the Bloodbreeds came here for revenge, but he didn't expect that they wanted to use this opportunity to gain a foothold on the surface. This was no longer a small squabble between overlords, but a full-fledged invasion. The surface and the abyss were two completely different worlds, and the result of a collision between the two would be the complete destruction of one side. There would be no other outcome. Although Zagund had many abyssal races under his command, they were still under the control of a human like him. In terms of numbers, they didn't have much of an advantage compared to the armies of the other lords. Therefore, other lords didn't have any extreme reactions other than despising Zagund for using the abyssal races to achieve his own goals. However, it was different this time. If Isolated Cliff City was really occupied by the Bloodbreeds, there was no doubt that the natives of Isolated Cliff City would be massacred. In the future, it was very likely that a large number of abyssal races would emerge in Isolated Cliff City and expand with Isolated Cliff City as the center. If that day really came, then Zagund would become the center of the entire continent, and all the high-grade powerhouses would point their spears at him, the initiator of all this. But that was all in the future. The benefits at present were obvious. If the Bloodbreeds occupied Isolated Cliff City, then under the joint forces of the two, the Holy Crown City and Wild Willow City would be destroyed one by one. Taking back Black Raven City would be a piece of cake. Zagund finally couldn't keep his calm, and a look of struggle appeared on his face. It was ridiculous and sad. As a fallen dark druid, Zagund had to rely on the power of the abyssal races to gain a foothold in the world and gradually realize his ambitions. However, his glory couldn't be built on the foundation of the extinction of human beings. After all, Zagund was a human. Although he knew that he wasn't accepted by human society, denying human beings was the same as denying himself. Alquite looked at the human lord in front of him with a smile. In fact, there were several times when Alquite wanted to use his spiritual power to influence Zagund's thinking. However, Alquite knew very well that for warriors who lived in the mountains of swords and seas of blood all year round, his enormous spiritual power might not be able to play its role. These people's minds were usually very firm. Even if a god appeared in front of them, he believed that a considerable number of them would choose to move forward bravely instead of kneeling on the ground and submitting to him. Alquite would never do something that would backfire on him. Instead of being noticed and having conflicting emotions, it was better to let him choose for himself. Alquite believed that the bait he threw out was tempting enough. At least, this ambitious human lord in front of him wouldn't give up such a big piece of cake. At this moment, the door of the living room was pushed open. 4 3-meter-tall monsters with ferocious faces walked in one after another and lined up behind Zagund. Alquite's pupils suddenly contracted to a point like the tip of a needle. He coldly sized up the 4 monsters. The faces of the 4 monsters were extremely ugly. Not to mention children who stopped crying. Even adults would be shocked. Finally, Alquite's gaze fell on the huge bone scythes in the hands of the monsters. He realized that the 4 monsters didn't have left hands. He suddenly thought of a rumor and asked tentatively, "The 7 exiled whip brothers?" I didn't expect Prince Alquite to know about his brothers. One of the monsters laughed loudly. Alquite shut his mouth, but his face was extremely cold. He once thought that he had the advantage, but it was overturned in an instant. He never thought that Zagund would actually recruit the 7 whip brothers. Although Alquite had a powerful and insufferably arrogant aura, he wasn't arrogant enough to think that the Blood Tribe was invincible. When it came to the ranking in the Abyss, the Blood Tribe would never be number 1. Even the Black Dragons, who could ignore all magic attacks, and stirred up countless bloody storms, would have to give way in front of the seven whip brothers. Abyss demons, the archenemies of the heaven realm's archangels, the most loyal servants of the death god Hamas. Among all the powerful races, the Abyss demons' combat power might not be the strongest, but they were definitely the most troublesome, because all the Abyss demons had the same innate ability, teleportation. Moreover, there was no limit to teleportation as long as they wanted to. From the abyss to the surface, although no one dared to disturb them, Alquit and his people had flown for more than a month. If the Abyss demons wanted to run to the surface, it would only take a few days. If they were strong enough, they would realize that killing a demon was much more difficult than killing a giant dragon. This was because the demons could escape from the battlefield anytime and anywhere at the fastest speed. If they weren't strong enough, they would also realize that escaping was a luxurious fantasy. No creature could escape the pursuit of the demons. On the battlefield, demons were even more daunting existences. They could gather the power of their clansmen and form an attack power that could instantly kill everything in a line or a point. This kind of wolf pack tactic had already caused the fall of countless angels of light. However, the seven whip brothers' identities were a bit special. The Abyss demons had their own rules. Because the seven whip brothers violated some taboos, their right hand were chopped off by the Abyss demons, and they were expelled. However, Alquit was very clear that he definitely couldn't fight against seven demons, even if they were seven disabled demons. The result of the confrontation was that his people were all slaughtered, and then the seven demons began to chase after him. Alquit, who was exhausted, couldn't escape the fate of death. "I'm very curious," Alquit said in a cold voice. "With the seven whip brothers as your assistants, do you really need time? I've encountered some problems." Zagun paused and sighed. "You'll understand in a few days. The seven whip brothers, it seems that we're missing three now." Alquit's gaze kept sweeping across the few demons. Zagun smiled. "They're staying where they're needed." "Oh." Alquit closed his eyes slightly. He was very depressed in his heart. It could even be said that he was sullen. He hadn't experienced this feeling for a long time, but he had no other choice but to endure it. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 277. Han Jin controlled the ship to move slowly in the air. Below them, there was black fog everywhere. It was like a huge tortoise shell, completely covering an area of tens of miles. It was impossible to find the exact location of Fort Maxine. It was said that the abyssal mages would not be affected by the fog. But how would the people of Fort Maxine survive? They were all surface races. "Sir, we are flying so low. What if we are attacked by the abyssal mages? What should we do?" Lang Ning said worriedly. There were hundreds of abyssal mages hidden in the black fog. Even with Guevara's strength, he was still at a disadvantage. He did not think that the ship's defense would be stronger than Guevara's. "Sir Jed's, do you have any ideas?" Han Jin's gaze fell on Jed's. "Light magic can indeed effectively suppress the growth of darkness, but I need a team of priests. The power of one person is still too insignificant," Jed's softly replied as he observed the black fog below them. "Since you don't have any ideas, I can only use my method." Han Jin paused and took out the soul-devouring orb from his space ring. He patted it lightly, and a cloud of black smoke floated out of the orb and formed Harley's body. The spirit of the soul-devouring orb and Han Jin were telepathically connected. There was no need for Han Jin to explain anything. Harley's body gradually expanded and finally became a giant skeleton that was tens of meters tall. However, the color of the black smoke became extremely faint, and it was almost impossible to see clearly. Harley let out a low roar and suddenly exploded into a cloud of smoke. It floated down and finally merged with the black fog on the ground. Han Jin slowly left his seat and walked to Jed's side. He looked down, and after a while, he suddenly said without thinking, "Aren't you going to say something to me?" Jed's was a smart man, and he immediately understood what Han Jin meant. A faint smile appeared on his face. "What do you want me to say to you?" Han Jin shrugged. "I thought you hated all dark creatures." Jedis was silent for a moment, then smiled and said, "Yes, I dislike that Harley, but that's not a reason why I have to say or do anything." "Ha! Nikola taught me a lot of things, especially the last time. He told me that he hates it when people tell him what to do. It can be said that he has endured it for a very, very long time. I won't make the same mistake again." Han Jin stared blankly at the fog below and did not reply. "Actually, nothing else is important. What's important is your character." Jed said slowly, "I see many precious things in your friends. They're simple, naive, kind, honest, and righteous. To be friends with them, your heart must be very pure. Harley is just a weapon for you, isn't it?" "Justice." Han Jin couldn't help but smile sarcastically. Influenced by culture, he had always believed that there was little real justice in the world. "The so-called thief shall be punished. 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 Thief shall be punished," and so on. This is the most important thing. Jed's expression became very serious. He also felt the frivolity and contempt in Han Jin's words. "At the very least, you must firmly believe that everything you do is righteous." "If I think I'm righteous, then am I really righteous?" Han Jin asked with a smile. "If you don't believe in yourself, will others believe in you?" Jed's asked back, "I understand." Han Jin was silent for a moment, then slowly nodded, then smiled and changed the topic. Some things were easy to understand, and it was not good to be too clear. "You just said simple, naive, kind, and honest. Them? Tell me in detail. Which one of them is naive?" So, Morrison's and the others hurriedly turned their heads. Other descriptions were fine, but for a group of adults, naive was almost equivalent to a derogatory term. No one wanted to be naive. However, with Jed's personality, he would never speak nonsense. Someone had to stand up and take the blame, or Jed's would point out. Everyone looked at each other, and in the end, many people's eyes focused on Morrison's. "What are you all looking at me for?" Morrison's said angrily. "Because you are naive," Sasu said. "And stupid," Leger also chimed in. "Stupid and naive," Gibran concluded. You. Morrison's was angry and anxious. However, Sasu and the others were indeed smarter than him, not to mention a cunning and evil guy like Gibran. In the past, he had been at a disadvantage the most. When everyone first came together, he could bully Sasu, but that was because Sasu did not guard against him. After a long time, he could not even beat Sasu and lost badly. "Lord Raphael, do you know how Lola's alliance was formed?" Jeds did not pay attention to the boring joke. "I don't know." Han Jin shook his head. "If you can really defeat Zagund, you will know." After saying this, Jeds closed his mouth and did not want to say any more. Han Jin's heart moved, and he could not help but fall into deep thought. To be precise, it was all because of selfish desires and the desire for power. The civilians on the mainland hoped that the mainland would become a unified country and stop the endless killing. The middle class, such as some small landowners and merchants, also hoped that the mainland would be peaceful and they could live safely and do business safely. However, the lords who control the army did not want to see this. In their own territory, the lords had the highest power, and life and death were just a matter of a word from them. They were a group of uncrowned kings. If there was a unified country, the power they held would be greatly reduced. Who would be willing to go from an uncrowned king to a retainer? The Holy See's attitude had always been ambiguous, and this was why Jeds was very dissatisfied with the Pope. On one hand, he wanted to use Nicholas's power to spread the glory of the God of Light and restore the past glory. On the other hand, he was worried that Nicholas's strength was too strong and would pose a threat to the Holy See. One day, he would fully support, and the next, he would try to obstruct or even support Nicholas's enemies. This was too capricious. The Holy See wanted to control everything, but they ignored the strong people who could reach the top of the pyramid, who would be willing to be controlled by others. As a result, the conflict between the Holy See and Nicholas became more and more intense, and finally reached an irreconcilable point. Also, Lola was so respectful and obedient to the Holy See only because she was threatened by Nicholas. If Lola and Nicholas were in each other's positions, would Lola make the same choice as Nicholas? In fact, as early as when Nicholas asked for help from the Dragon Realm, Jed's had a faint premonition that Nicholas would sooner or later fall out with the Holy See. However, he did not expect it to come so quickly and so suddenly. After experiencing the nirvana of life and death, Jed's state of mind had undergone a huge change. He no longer believed that the lords and nobles could be trusted because the entanglement of interests was too complicated and unpredictable. He had already turned his attention to the commoners who were ignored by the strong. In comparison, the commoners' desires were simple and easily satisfied. They just wanted a safe environment to live in. Therefore, he emphasized justice in front of Han Jin. What is justice? To completely end the chaotic situation. Now, Jed's was on the opposite side of the Pope. The Pope had always insisted that the Holy See's dignity could be displayed to the greatest extent in a world with many vassals. In the past, Jed's thought this was correct, but now he realized that the so-called dignity of the Holy See was explained at the cost of countless civilians being displaced, slaughtered, and enslaved. This was the most shameless distortion of the doctrine. Of course, according to Jed's current point of view, Nicholas was also righteous. However, Jed's was after all a believer, and it was impossible for him to cooperate with a king who used and destroyed the Holy See. Therefore, in his eyes, Nicholas became the representative of evil. Guevara and Majordomo Gale looked at each other. They both heard Jed's judgment and understood what Jed's meant. Majordomo Gale's eyes flickered, and no one knew what he was thinking. Guevara smiled and slowly stroked his dragon spear. In this regard, Han Jin was just a novice and could not be compared to those sly old foxes. Moreover, this was too complicated, and not just anyone who said a few words could immediately understand everything. Majordomo Gale did not say anything because he had his own ideas, and Guevara did not say anything because he wanted Han Jin to slowly understand on his own. "Sir, look there." Suddenly, a general pointed below and shouted. The fog in an area slowly changed, and a vortex slowly formed. The black fog in the center was all swept away, and an abyssal mage who was fiddling with a strange object looked at the sky in shock. He did not know why the black fog suddenly left him. Han Jin raised his eyebrows slightly. Little Gold Bolt let out a crisp chirp and suddenly flew away from the side of the ship. It spread its wings and swooped down. More than 100 Thunderbirds followed behind Little Gold Bolt, and pairs of wings covered a small part of the sky. The abyssal mage hurriedly jumped up and ran towards the black fog with all his might. However, something strange happened. No matter where he ran, the black fog would avoid him. The abyssal mage ran around in an extremely sorry state, but he could not find any protection. Streaks of lightning shot down and gathered at a point on the abyssal mage's body. Following a deafening explosion, the abyssal mage turned into countless pieces of flesh and blood. The attack of a single 9th-rank Thunderbird was already quite powerful. The simultaneous attack of more than 100 Thunderbirds was unimaginable. Even a peak powerhouse might not be able to guarantee their own safety. Little Gold Bolt circled half a circle before spreading its wings and flying back to the side of the ship. It kept chirping, somewhat dissatisfied and unsatisfied. Lang Ning looked at the Thunderbirds in shock. He knew that the Thunderbirds were 9th-rank magical beasts, and he could not even defeat one of them. However, the Thunderbirds' behavior was too orderly, as if there was an invisible hand controlling them. They were no different from soldiers. The flock of thunderbirds had just returned to the side of the ship when a huge javelin made of gas suddenly flew out from the black fog and shot straight at the ship. Then, different spells shot out from all directions, all aimed at the ship. This was the abyssal mages taking revenge for their companions, and also to test the ship's defense. Chapter 278. Hanjin's gaze fell on Yelena. Yelena smiled confidently. After working hard for more than a month, she, Jedis, Hogan, and Kane worked together to set up a giant magic array. It was not something that could be easily destroyed, especially this kind of probing attack, which could be completely ignored. Boom, boom, boom. Explosions of magic flashed beneath the ship, but the ship didn't even sway in the slightest. It continued to fly forward steadily. What a powerful defense! Ronning exclaimed in amazement. Raphael, does your ship have a name? Guevara suddenly asked. No, why? Do you want to give it a name? Hanjin laughed. How about the God of War? Guevara said slowly. That's a good name. It's impressive. Morrison's exclaimed. Yes, I agree. Saxon was also exhilarated. Wherever the God of War points, all the enemies will be destroyed. It is invincible and invincible. Sasu showed the qualities of a bard. However, this kind of thing should be told by future generations, not by him. That's what it means. Guevara smiled. He was talking to Hanjin, but he was looking at Major Domo Gale from the corner of his eyes. With his back facing everyone, Jedis smiled. Among the people on the ship, he, Guevara, and Major Domo Gale were almost the same in terms of strength, experience, forming a triangle. He also knew Major Domo Gale's identity, and even more so, the intention of Guevara's words. Don't forget, no matter what glory the God of War achieves in the future, Yelena will have a part to play. Major Domo Gale's expression did not change, and his smile was the same as before, as if he did not understand Guevara's words. I will also have a part to play. Kane laughed. Me? Don't forget me. Hogan also rushed to take the credit. Guevara, on the other hand, was stunned. When people like him talked to each other, the meaning in their words was always vague. He could hear that Major Domo Gale had proposed a plan that would satisfy both sides. Guevara's gaze swept past Sunir and finally landed on Yelena. This is impossible. Hanjin sat back in his chair, and the giant ship slowly rose into the sky. Strictly speaking, the giant ship he was driving was also a magic weapon that required his vital energy to support it. Of course, he would try his best to avoid consumption. Although the magic defense circle set up by Yelena and the others was still very stable, it was meaningless to just stand there and take the enemy's attack. The spells flying out of the black fog became even fiercer. The abyssal mages took Hanjin's evasion as cowardice. They felt that they might be able to defeat that colossus. Streams of flames, fireballs, meteorites falling from the sky, acid rain with strong corrosive power, and so on were all surrounding the giant ship. In addition to the unique abyssal magic, most of the abyssal mages were proficient in earth and fire magic because they lived in the depths of the earth all year round. There were rivers and lakes made of pure lava, and the earth and fire elements were very active. Compared to the mages on the ground, their cultivation could achieve twice the results with half the effort. The magic defense circle around the giant ship shook slightly, but the ship itself was still very stable. Hanjin calmly observed the magic light balls that kept exploding in the sky. It could be said that he was admiring it. His past experience told Hanjin that it was better to trust himself than to trust others. The magic defense circle set up by Yelena was just a cover. The giant ship was a magic weapon that he had refined with all his strength, and its defense was far stronger than Yelena's circle. However, now is not the time to show off. Sir, should we fight back? Hogan shouted. Not only him, but Yelena and Kane were also eager to fight back. It was not their style to take a beating without fighting back. Wait, don't be hasty, Hanjin said softly. As time passed, the vortex created by Harley continued to expand. The Abyssal Mages also noticed the abnormality and changed their target, desperately fighting with Harley for control. No matter how this world divided magic and combat energy, Han Jin still firmly adhered to his own standards, which were the rules of Tao. It turned out that his standards were equally effective. Harley was a ghost spirit and could be nourished and replenished by all substances with the aura of Een. Now, Harley alone was fighting against hundreds of abyssal mages, and he was not at a disadvantage at all. The black vortex sometimes stagnated and sometimes slowly flowed. However, the longer it flowed, the more Harley gradually gained the upper hand. Finally, all the black fog within a radius of dozens of miles was sucked into the vortex. Han Jin's giant ship began to tilt downwards, and its speed increased abruptly. It shot toward the vortex like lightning, and at the same time, the vortex began to extend upwards, drawing the black fog that shrouded the ground into the sky. Harley's figure reappeared. At this moment, he had turned into a giant skeleton that was countless times larger than Han Jin's giant ship. Yelena, Kane, and Hogan were already standing at the side of the ship, holding their magic staffs tightly. When the black fog was completely sucked away and the abyssal mages revealed themselves, they released powerful spells at the same time. Lightning flashed in the sky, and thick, twisted lightning pillars smashed into the ground, followed by more than a dozen meteorites wrapped in thick flames. Hogan also released an ice storm, and countless thin, sharp ice formed a frenzy that swept toward the abyssal mages. The abyssal mages had served Zagun for a long time, so they were very experienced in battle. Seeing that they couldn't control the barrier, they had already gathered together. An open magic shield shielded the hundreds of abyssal mages inside. Lightning, meteorites, and Hogan's ice storm bombarded the magic shield until it was violently distorted, but in the end, they couldn't break through the defense of the shield. Yelena was not convinced and raised her magic staff again. At this moment, the leader of the abyssal mages, a monster with a bull's head, released a scroll, and an even larger magic shield unfolded. Then, the monster with a bull's head stretched out its arms and looked up at the sky. The rest of the abyssal mages did the same. Harley was a guy who didn't want to be left out. He waved his bone staff, which was hundreds of meters long and made of mist, and knocked on the magic shield. Unfortunately, he had almost no attack power, and the magic shield didn't even budge. Waves of obscure magic waves came, and an inexplicable vibration was faintly produced in the air. It seemed like an illusion, but it also seemed like it could be clearly felt. This feeling was difficult to describe with words. There's a high-level bull priest. Guevara's expression turned serious. This is a forbidden spell triggered by magic power deprivation, revelation of the abyss. After all, Guevara had dealt with the abyssal race before, so he was the first to determine what spell the enemy had released. Revelation of the abyss. Yelena was stunned, and then she shouted, "Raphael, let's go. Leave this place. It's too late." Guevara shouted in a low voice, then turned his gaze to Han Jin. "Raphael." The magic defense circle set up by Yelena couldn't withstand the attack of this forbidden spell, so he could only pin his hopes on Han Jin. He hoped to find a clear answer from Han Jin, whether it was possible or not. However, Han Jin was still sitting quietly on the chair with his eyes slightly closed. His expression was calm and indifferent, as if he didn't know what was about to happen. The magic waves became more and more intense, and one by one, the abyssal mages suddenly fell to the ground and fainted. This was the result of their magic power being deprived. "Raphael," Guevara shouted again. "What are you guys in a hurry for?" Jedi said with a smile. He leaned against the side of the ship, looking calm and unruffled, like a tourist who was enjoying the scenery. If Raphael only brought a few of us on the ship, then it would be hard to make a judgment, but he brought everyone on board. So I'm curious, what are you guys in a hurry for?" Guevara immediately understood what Jedis meant. If he didn't have enough confidence, Han Jin wouldn't have brought Sunir, Morrison's, and the others on the ship. In case of a terrible attack, he, Jedis, Major Domo Gale, and Yelena might have the ability to protect themselves, but the others would die without a doubt. It wasn't that Jedi's was calmer than Guevara. The reason was that when Guevara met Han Jin's strength wasn't very strong. When Jedi's and Han Jin met in the world of Warcraft Forest, Han Jin was already an unfathomable powerhouse in Jedi's eyes. Therefore, Jedi's judgment was too trusting of Han Jin, and Guevara was a little anxious. Understood. Guevara took a deep breath. Then let's wait and see. Perhaps because he heard Jedi's words, Han Jin smiled faintly, and the restless atmosphere on the ship miraculously calmed down. Sunir, Sisu, Gibran, and the others looked around curiously, waiting for the upcoming confrontation. At this moment, they entrusted their lives and deaths to Han Jin. The whole sky gradually turned red, and the Minotaur priest's incantation was coming to an end. His body trembled slightly, and his voice became a hysterical roar. Is it fire? Han Jin slowly opened his eyes. The sky is clear, the earth is turbid, the 5 elements flow, the water rises, the fire disappears. Open. Han Jin's last word was like a thunderclap, exploding between heaven and earth and rolling far away. No one could understand Han Jin's incantation, but everyone felt a kind of power. At the same time, the Minotaur priest let out a final roar, and balls of incomparably beautiful flames appeared in the air. As if attracted, they all rushed towards Han Jin's giant ship. In the end, there were less than 10 abyssal mages who were still standing there. Hundreds of abyssal mages had all exhausted their magic power. No one, including Jedi's and Majordomo Gale, thought that there would be such a bright flame in the world. It was so bright that it was indescribable, and it even emitted a dense, colorful light. It rushed towards the giant ship from all directions, covering the whole sky and the whole earth. The magic defense circle set up by Yelena lasted for a moment before it was swallowed by the endless flames. Looking at the flames covering the sky and the earth, and falling down on them, no matter how much trust they had in Han Jin, they couldn't help but hold their breaths. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.